Tonight we're diving into the entire history of the Fremen, the desert people of Arrakis, from their long wandering across the stars to the day their fighting men carried a young man to the throne of the known universe. Settle in, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here that can reach you, only a slow and gentle telling of a hardy people and the endless sands they called home. Over the next 20 chapters we will move, without haste, through all of it, the Zensuni wanderers and their long migration, the hidden sietches beneath the dunes, the water discipline that kept them alive, the still suits and the great sandworms they learned to ride, their quiet religion, the dream of a green Arrakis, and their rise as the force that would change the fate of an empire. You do not need to hold any of it. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, gently, down towards sleep. Far out along the trailing edge of the known universe, past the busy trade lanes and the glittering worlds where the great houses gathered their wealth, there turns a single dry planet that the star charts of the Imperium name Arrakis, though almost everyone who has ever spoken of it with fear or with longing simply calls it Dune. It is a world of sand and stone and endless open sky, a place where rain has not fallen in living memory, and where the horizon in every direction is a soft and shifting line of dunes that roll on and on like a frozen ocean that has forgotten how to be water. The days there are bright and merciless, and the nights are cold and vast and scattered with more stars than any gentle sleeper could ever hope to count. And it is upon this quiet, burning, patient world that our story begins, not with the emperors who ruled from far away, and not with the noble families who schemed for the treasure buried in its sands, but with the people who actually lived there, who were born on the sand and who died on the sand, and who called that harsh and beautiful desert their only home. These people are known throughout the galaxy as the Fremen, and for a very long time they were the most misunderstood folk in all the wide reaches of the Empire. To the off-worlders who came and went, who arrived in their sealed vehicles and their climate-controlled towns, and who never once ventured past the safe walls of the cities, the Fremen were little more than rumor, a scattering of ragged desert dwellers glimpsed at the edges of the market, or shapes that vanished behind a rock when a patrol drew near. The grand and comfortable people of the Imperium like to speak of them as savages, as a few wandering bands of superstitious nomads who scraped a bare and hopeless living out of the emptiness, too poor to matter and too primitive to fear. That was the story the powerful told themselves, and it was a story that suited them very well, for it let them look out across the great southern deserts and see only worthless waste, only sand and silence, only a blank space on the map where nothing of importance could possibly be hidden. But the story was wrong, wonderfully and completely wrong, and part of the quiet pleasure of this long night of tales is that we, unlike the proud lords who ruled from their high stone halls, are going to learn the truth. For the Fremen were not few, and they were not helpless, and they were very far from foolish. Deep in the Great Bled, in the trackless heart of the southern desert where no comfortable stranger dared to follow, they had built a whole world of their own, a hidden civilization of caverns and secret gardens and patient, careful people. And their numbers were far greater than any census taker of the Empire had ever dreamed. They moved across the dunes as easily as the fish of old Earth had once moved through the sea, and they knew every ripple of the sand and every scent upon the wind, and they had learned, over countless generations, to survive in a place that would have killed almost anyone else within a single day. The name they gave themselves tells us much about who they truly were. Fremen, in the soft and ancient tongue they carried out of their long wandering past, meant simply the free men, the free folk of the sand, and they wore that name with a deep and unhurried pride. They bowed to no governor, and they knelt before no distant throne, and though the great powers of the galaxy believed themselves the masters of Arrakis, the Fremen of the deep desert knew, in their patient hearts, that no offworlder had ever truly ruled the sand. The cities belonged to the strangers, perhaps, and the walled towns and the landing fields and the counting houses, but the open desert, the vast and terrible interior where the storms walked like giants and the great sandworms swam beneath the dunes, that belonged to the Fremen alone, and always had, and they were content to let the mighty believe otherwise, while they waited and watched and endured. If you had somehow come upon one of them in those days, in the shadow of a rock at the cool blue edge of evening, the very first thing you would have noticed, before anything else at all, would have been the eyes. For the eyes of the Fremen were unlike the eyes of any other people in the Empire, a deep and startling blue, a blue laid over blue, with no white showing anywhere at all, so that the whole eye seemed to hold the color of a clear desert twilight. This remarkable coloring came from the spice, the strange and precious substance called melange that saturated the very air and dust and food of Arrakis, and that no one who lived upon that world could ever fully escape. Year after year the spice worked its slow and quiet change, staining the eyes ever deeper into that unearthly blue within blue, so that a person had only to look upon a Fremen face to know that here was one who had breathed the desert for a lifetime, and whose body carried the mark of Dune in the very windows of the soul. And there was so much more to them than any stranger could see at a glance. The Fremen were a people of extraordinary discipline, raised from earliest childhood to waste nothing, to hoard every drop of moisture, to move without sound, and to strike without warning, and to keep their true feelings hidden behind a calm and watchful stillness. Water, on that dry world, was the most precious thing of all, more precious than any jewel or coin, and the Fremen had woven their whole way of living around its careful keeping. They wore clever suits that reclaimed the very moisture of their bodies, and they spoke of water with a reverence that outsiders found strange, and they carried in their disciplined hearts a fierce and unspoken loyalty to one another that no offworlder ever quite understood. Beneath the ragged cloaks and the dust-stained robes there lived a courage so deep and so quiet that it needed no boasting, and a shrewd, enduring intelligence that had outlasted empire after empire without ever once bending the knee. So picture them now as the long night settles softly around you and the stars of Arrakis wheel slowly overhead. Picture a proud and watchful people hidden away in the deep folds of the desert, gathered in their warm and secret caverns while the cold wind sighs across the dunes above. Picture them tending their careful stores of water, teaching their children the old and patient skills, sitting quietly around low fires and remembering the long road that had brought them to this place, waiting, always waiting, with the endless calm of those who have made peace with a hard land. Far above them, in orbiting ships and marble palaces, the great powers of the galaxy schemed and plotted over who would hold the spice and who would rule the sand. But the Fremen simply watched and waited and endured, as they had endured for longer than any of those schemers could remember, a free and unbroken people biding their time in the deep and dreaming desert. And how did such a people come to be there, in the harshest place in all the known worlds? Where did they come from? these free men of the sand, and what long and sorrowful journey had carried them across the darkness of space to this single dry and distant world. That is a story older than Arrakis itself, a story of wandering and hardship, and a faith kept alive through many bitter generations. And it is the story we will follow next. Up next in Chapter 2, the Zensunni Wanderers will drift gently back along the ages and follow the long and winding path of the Fremen ancestors, the patient wanderers who crossed 100 lonely worlds before they ever found their home upon the sand. So let your breathing slow, and let the desert grow quiet, and rest now while the stars keep their soft and steady watch above the dunes. Chapter 2. The Zensunni Wanderers. To understand the Fremen of Arrakis and the deep quiet strength that lived inside them, one must travel very far back in time, far beyond the sands of the desert planet, far beyond the memory of any living person, into the dim and gentle twilight of ancient history. For the Fremen were not born upon Arrakis, and their story did not begin among its dunes. Their story began long ago, on other worlds and under other stars, with a wandering people who carried an old and patient faith with them wherever they were driven, and who came at last to be called the Zensunni. The name Zensunni came down through the ages like a smooth stone worn soft by many rivers, formed from the joining of older names and older beliefs, from teachings that reached all the way back to the first home of humankind, to old Earth itself, that distant cradle from which every human throughout the scattered galaxy had first set out. In those far and forgotten centuries, many faiths had flourished upon that ancient world, and many peoples had sought after truth in many quiet ways. And over the slow turning of thousands of years, those old beliefs mingled and softened and flowed together, the way small streams gather and join and become at last one wide and steady current. From that gentle blending arose the way of the Zensunni, a faith of patience and endurance, a faith that taught its followers to look inward for peace and to hold fast to the deep, still center of themselves, even when the world around them offered no rest at all. The Zensunni were, above all things, a wandering people. Across an immense stretch of history, longer than most minds can easily hold, they were carried from planet to planet, from one distant world to another, never truly resting, never truly free, always moving on beneath unfamiliar skies. Again and again they were taken into bondage, made slaves and servants to powerful masters who cared nothing for their faith and nothing for their longing to be left in peace. Again and again they were used and worn down and driven hard, and again, when the weight of their chains grew too heavy to bear, they rose and fled, slipping away into the dark spaces between the stars, seeking some quiet corner of the galaxy where they might at last be allowed to live as they wished. It is said that they passed through a great many worlds in this long and sorrowful migration, and that upon each of those worlds they left behind some small memory of themselves and carried away some small lesson in return. There was a time in the deep past when they dwelt upon a planet remembered only as a place of poets and of gentle learning, and there for a while they knew a measure of calm. But calm never lasted long for the Zensunni. Slavers came, or conquerors came, or hard new masters rose to power, and once more the wandering people were bound and burdened, and once more, in the fullness of time, they gathered their courage and broke free, and went out again into the endless night, carrying their faith like a small warm flame cupped carefully against the wind. This was the pattern of their days across uncounted generations. Enslavement and flight, bondage and escape, suffering and endurance, world after world after world. And though such a history might seem to promise only bitterness and despair, something remarkable happened instead within the hearts of these wandering people. For hardship, when it is borne with patience and with faith, does not always break a people. Sometimes it forges them. Sometimes it tempers them the way fire tempers good metal, drawing out weakness and leaving behind only what is strong and true and unbending. And so it was with the Zensunni. Each generation of suffering pressed them closer together and made them harder to defeat. Each escape taught them cunning and caution and the deep, quiet arts of survival. Each new world of exile taught them how to endure whatever the universe might send against them. Slowly, across the long centuries, there grew within them a love of freedom so fierce and so deep that it became the very heart of who they were. They had known slavery too many times, upon too many worlds, to ever again mistake comfort for liberty or safety for peace. They had learned, in the hardest of all schools, that freedom was worth more than ease, worth more than plenty, worth more even than the promise of rest. A Zensunni would rather flee across the cold gulfs between the stars than kneel in chains upon a soft and pleasant world. A Zensunni would rather thirst in freedom than drink deep in bondage. This fierce and unbending love of liberty passed from parent to child, down through the ages, growing stronger with each telling, until it was woven so deeply into their spirit that no chain could hold it, and no master could crush it. Their faith walked with them through all of this, steady and patient as an old and faithful companion. It taught them that the outer world might be cruel, but the inner world could remain untouched and serene. It taught them to be still within, to master their fear and their anger and their grief, to hold to a deep calm center no matter what storms raged around them. It taught them that a people could lose their home and their comfort and their freedom and still keep their souls entirely their own. And in the keeping of their souls, the Zensunni found a strength that their many masters could never understand and never take away. There were times, the old memories tell, when the wandering seemed as though it might never end, when one world of exile followed another in such a long gray procession that hope itself grew thin and worn. There were times when the Zensunni looked up at the wheeling stars and wondered whether any resting place awaited them anywhere in all the vast and turning galaxy, whether any world existed that was truly meant to be their own. And yet, they did not stop. They did not surrender. They gathered their children and their few belongings and their old faith, and they went on, because going on was the only freedom left to them, and freedom was the thing they loved above all else. And so, driven from world to world across thousands of years and many planets, hardened by persecution, tempered by suffering, bound together by a faith that would not die and a longing for liberty that would not fade, the Zensunni wandered ever onward through the long night of history. They did not yet know it, but the road they walked, that endless winding road of exile and escape, was carrying them slowly toward a single distant destination. Far ahead of them, out among the countless stars, there waited a harsh and burning world of sand and silence, a world that would seem to offer only death and thirst, and yet a world upon which this wandering people would at last become something wholly new. The desert was waiting for them, though they did not know its name, and the desert, in its own strange and patient way, was exactly the home that such a people had been seeking all along. For a folk who had been tempered by hardship would find in the desert a hardship that matched their strength. A folk who loved freedom above all else would find in the desert a freedom that no master could ever steal. And a folk who had learned to hold a deep still center against every storm would find upon those endless dunes a place where such stillness became the very art of staying alive. All of this lay ahead of them, unseen and unguessed, at the far end of their long migration. Up next, in Chapter 3, The Long Migration to Arrakis, we'll follow these wandering people along the final stretch of their long and patient road, and drift gently together toward the first sight of that golden desert world beneath its distant sun, where the story of the Zensunni would slowly begin to change into the story of the Fremen. Chapter 3. The long migration to Arrakis. For untold generations, the Zensunni wanderers had drifted from world to world, carrying with them nothing of great weight and everything of great meaning, and so by the time this chapter of their long story begins, they had already become a people shaped by distance and by patience. They had learned, across those many quiet centuries, that a home given to them by others was never truly a home, and that the only safety worth trusting was the safety they carried within themselves, folded quietly into their customs and their memories and the slow, steady rhythm of their walking. Each planet they had known had taken something from them and had given something back, and each departure had left them a little harder and a little more certain of who they were, until the wandering itself had become a kind of homeland, a country made not of soil but of shared endurance. And yet even the most patient of peoples longs, in the deepest and most secret places of the heart, for a resting place. Through all their generations of movement, the wanderers had passed from bondage into flight, and from flight into bondage again, sold and resettled and driven onward by rulers who saw in them only cheap and useful hands, and always they had gathered their few belongings and their many songs, and had gone on into the next unknown. Their history had been written in footsteps rather than in stone, and the story of those footsteps led, slowly and by a path that no single one of them could have foreseen, toward a small and bitter world at the far edge of the settled galaxy, a world of sand and silence that others regarded as fit only for punishment and exile. The world was called Arrakis by the learned, and Dune by those who came to know it in their bones, and it was, by every measure that ordinary settlers used, a place where no gentle life should ever have chosen to take root. It was a planet almost wholly given over to desert, wrapped in dunes that rolled from horizon to horizon like a frozen and endless sea, and across its vast dry surface there fell no rain worth the naming, and there gathered no rivers, and there rested no lakes to hold the soft reflection of the stars. What little moisture the world possessed hid itself away in the cold hours before dawn, or lay locked far beneath the sand in ways that no casual eye could find, and the open water that the peoples of kinder planets took so easily for granted was here the rarest and most precious of all things. To arrive upon such a world after so many generations of wandering must have seemed, at first, less like an arrival, and more like the final closing of a long and weary road. The rulers of the wider realm had scattered the wanderers here as they had scattered them so many times before, thinking of the desert as a cage whose bars were made of thirst and heat and distance, a place from which no troublesome people could ever hope to trouble anyone again. Those distant rulers looked upon the dunes and saw only emptiness, only a barren waste useful for the strange spice it yielded, and useful for nothing else, and they turned their attention back to their palaces and their fleets and their quarrels, believing that the matter of these particular exiles was settled once and for all. They did not understand, because they had never needed to understand, that a people already hardened by 100 sorrows might look upon that same emptiness and see not a cage, but a shelter, not an ending, but the quiet and hidden beginning of something wholly their own. For the wanderers did not break upon the sand as their masters had expected them to break. They had come too far and had survived too much to lie down and surrender to mere heat and dryness, and so instead of dying they began, slowly and with enormous patience, to learn. The lessons were hard, and many were paid for in loss. For the desert forgave nothing, and taught only through hunger and through the deaths of those who erred. But the wanderers had always been a people who watched and remembered, and now they watched the world of Dune with the whole of their attention, studying the way the sand held its faint coolness through the night, studying the small deep tricks by which the rare living things of the desert kept their moisture close, studying the wind and the dunes and the long, slow breathing of the open waste. Water, on this world, was not a comfort, but the very center of existence, the single thread from which every other thread of life was spun, and so the wanderers came to hold it in a reverence that no gentler planet could ever have taught them. They learned that a body loses moisture with every breath and every word and every drop of sweat, and so they learned to move with a stillness and an economy that wasted nothing, to speak softly and seldom, to shelter through the burning hours, and to travel through the cool of the dark. They learned to gather the faint dew of the dawn and to guard every measure of moisture as though it were the life of a child, and in time the very idea of carelessly spilling water came to seem to them a kind of quiet blindness, a foolishness belonging only to peoples who had never truly known what thirst could be. In this way, the harshness of Dune completed a work that the long generations of wandering had already begun. Slavery had hardened them, and flight had hardened them, and the endless resettling from world to world had hardened them. But it was the desert, patient and merciless and strangely honest, that finished the shaping. The world asked of them everything, and those who could not give everything did not remain, and so, season by season, and death by death, the people who endured upon the sand became something new, a folk fitted to the desert as closely as the desert creatures themselves, carrying within their bodies and their customs the deep hard wisdom of a place that would kill the unready without malice and without pause. And as they hardened, they withdrew. The rulers who nominally held the world kept to its narrow edges, to the fortified towns and the guarded ports where the spice was gathered and shipped away, and they left the vast interior of the desert to the wind and the worms and the emptiness. For the deep desert was to them a place of certain death and no reward. But it was into that very deep desert, beyond the last outposts of the powerful, beyond the reach of their eyes and their soldiers and their tallies, that the wanderers quietly went. They slipped away from the settled fringes and into the trackless heart of the dunes, into the country that no ruler bothered to claim. And there, hidden by distance and by the sheer indifference of the sand, they began to make for themselves a life that no outsider could see. So it was that a new civilization took root beneath the surface of a world that others had written off as empty. In the shadow of the rock, and in the hidden hollows of the deep desert, the wanderers gathered themselves into something more than survivors, something that would in time be called the Fremen, the free folk of the sand. Though on this quiet night we are still only at the beginning of that becoming. Their numbers grew slowly and secretly. Their knowledge deepened. Their customs settled into place. And above them, the rulers of Arrakis went on believing that the desert held nothing but sand and silence, never dreaming that beneath that silence a whole and hidden people was learning, patiently and without haste, how to make the harshest world in the galaxy into a home. And there, for the moment, we may let the great sweep of the migration come gently to its rest, with a hardened and hidden people settling into the deep places of Dune. Up next in Chapter 4, life in the deep desert, we'll drift softly down into the hidden hollows of the sand to see how these free folk of the wasteland shaped their quiet days, how they carved their sheltered homes into the living rock, and how, far from the eyes of any ruler, they wove the small and enduring rhythms of a secret life beneath the endless dunes. Chapter 4. Life in the deep desert, far from the walled cities and the guarded gardens of the great houses, out beyond the last line of rock, where the maps of the off-worlders simply faded into blankness. There lay the true face of Arrakis, and it was here, in the deep desert, that the Fremen made their long and patient home. The migration that had carried their ancestors across the stars and down at last onto this burning world had ended in a place that seemed, to any newcomer, to be nothing more than death spread flat beneath an enormous sky. Yet the Fremen had learned to read that emptiness as a farmer reads his fields, and where a stranger saw only ruin, they saw 1,000 quiet signs of water, of shelter, and of danger, all written plainly for those with the patience to study them across the slow turning of many years. The deep desert was a land of two great extremes, and the Fremen shaped their whole existence around the gentle art of surviving both. By day, the sun climbed white and pitiless into a sky the color of pale silver, and the heat came down not as a single weight, but as a living pressure that seemed to press against the skin and to draw the very moisture out from the body of anything foolish enough to move without care. The sands themselves grew hot enough to blister an unprotected hand, and the air above them shivered and swam so that distant dunes appeared to float and to ripple as though the whole world were made of slow water. In such heat, the Fremen did not hurry, and they did not waste. They rested in the shaded hours, folded quietly into the shadow of a rock, or sealed within the cool dimness of their sietch, and they moved when moving cost them least, and always, always, they thought first of the water they carried, and of the water they might lose. For the great teacher of the deep desert was thirst, and its great discipline was the saving of every single drop. The Fremen wore garments made with astonishing cleverness, close suits that gathered the moisture of breath and of sweat and of the body itself, filtering it and cooling it and returning it, drop by patient drop, to be drunk again. To lose water carelessly was the one true sin of that harsh land, and a Fremen child learned before it could walk far that a tear shed without need was a small betrayal, that the dead gave up their water to the living, and that a person was measured not by gold or by title, but by the number of drops they carried and the wisdom with which they kept them. The off-worlders spoke of riches in terms of the precious spice, but the Fremen counted their wealth in water, hidden away in great cisterns deep beneath the rock, saved against the far and dreamed of day, when the desert itself might one morning bloom. When the sun at last slipped down toward the western dunes, the second face of the desert revealed itself. For as the light drained away, so too did the warmth, and the killing heat of the day gave way with startling swiftness to a cold that was very nearly as fierce. The clear and cloudless sky, which had shielded nothing from the sun, now held nothing back of the day's gathered warmth, and it rose and fled upward into the dark until the sands lay chilled beneath a vast and glittering spread of stars. The Fremen knew this cold as intimately as they knew the heat, and they welcomed the falling of the temperature even as they wrapped themselves against it, for the cool of night was the kind and traveling time, the hours when a body spent the least of its precious moisture, and when the long journeys across the open sand were most safely made. Those journeys carried them out across the bled, the vast and trackless sand seas that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single mark of stone or shelter to break their sweeping curves. The open bled was beautiful in the way that only the truly immense can be, a great slow ocean of dunes that had never known a footprint, rising and falling in long ridges shaped by the patient labor of the wind. To cross it was to become very small beneath a very large sky, and the Fremen crossed it as sailors once crossed water, reading the shape of the dunes in the direction of the wind and the slow wheel of the stars to find their way where there were no roads and never would be. They carried what they needed and no more, and they trusted to their skill and to their memory of the land, passed down through the generations, to guide them safely from one hidden refuge to the next. Yet the open sand held a danger far greater than heat or thirst or cold, for beneath the deep desert lived the great sandworms, the vast and ancient makers whose passage could be felt as a trembling in the ground long before they came into view. These enormous creatures, longer than any ship and older than any memory, moved through the sand as though it were the sea, drawn upward and onward by any steady and repeating beat that reached them through the depths. And so the Fremen learned, over the long, slow centuries of their dwelling there, one of the strangest and most beautiful of all their skills, the art of walking upon the sand without rhythm. A steady tread, an even and marching pace of the kind that any soldier might use, would ring down through the grains like a bell and summon the worm from far away. But a broken step, an unevenness woven with quiet care into the very manner of walking, would pass unnoticed, so that a Fremen crossing the open bled moved in a way that seemed almost like a dance, a shifting and irregular passage that mimicked the natural settling of the sand and left the deep sleepers undisturbed below. To read the coming of a worm, to feel its approach in the soles of the feet, and to know by the quality of the trembling how far away it ran and how fast it came, was among the most vital of all the desert crafts. And it stood beside the reading of the weather and the reading of the signs of water as one of the three great literacies of that harsh world. The Fremen watched the sky for the gathering of the terrible storms that could strip the flesh from bone and grind stone into dust, and they knew the small changes in the wind and the taste of the air that came before such fury, and they sheltered themselves in time. They watched the sand for the faint traces of moisture that gathered in certain hollows before the dawn, and they knew where the hardy desert plants had sunk their patient roots, and they read 100 quiet clues that told them where life clung on beneath the surface of a world that seemed to hold no life at all. And in all of this there was a quality that lay deeper even than skill, a quiet and unhurried endurance that had become the very soul of the Fremen people. They did not merely survive the deep desert as a shipwrecked sailor might cling to a raft, waiting to be saved. They belonged to it, and it to them, and they had made of the most hostile place in all the known worlds a true and living home, raising their children within it and burying their dead within it, and dreaming, across the long generations, of the green world it might one day become, where all others would have perished in a single day. The Fremen thrived, calm and careful and strong, folded into the rhythms of heat and cold and worm and wind as a sleeper is folded into the gentle rhythm of a long and peaceful night. Up next in Chapter 5, the Sietch and Fremen Society will step out of the open sand and into the hidden hollows of the rock, and there we'll wander quietly through the cool and sheltered caverns where the Fremen made their homes together, and we'll listen, softly and without hurry, to the gentle ways in which they lived and shared and cared for one another, far from the eyes of the wider world. Chapter 5. The Sietch and Fremen Society. Far beneath the burning surface of Arrakis, where the sun could never reach and the great worms could never come, the Fremen made their homes in the cool and quiet dark of the rock, These hidden places were called sietches, and each one was a world unto itself, a warren of chambers and passages carved patiently into the bones of the mountains and the deep folds of the shield wall. Secret from the sky, and secret from all enemies who did not know the desert as the Fremen knew it. To wander the open sand by day, as the tribe had done in the chapters before this one, was to live always in motion and always in watchfulness. But to return at last to the sietch was to come home, to pass through the narrow throat of stone and feel the temperature fall away and the great heat of the world lift from one's shoulders like a heavy cloak set gently aside. A traveler who did not belong could walk across the surface directly above a sietch and never guess that thousands of people lived and worked and slept in the rock below. For the Fremen had learned across countless generations to hide every sign of their passing. The entrances were disguised with such care that the moving sand itself seemed to close over them, and the moisture that a careless people might have let escape into the air was instead sealed away behind heavy dust plugs and layered doors, held close and precious within. Inside, the corridors turned and branched and rose and fell, and the light was soft and yellow, cast by small hand-fashioned glow globes that drifted at the level of a person's shoulder and needed neither flame nor fuel, only the patient tending of those who kept them. The sietch was above all a place of belonging, and every soul within it had a place and a purpose and a set of obligations owed to all the others. At the head of each sietch stood the naib, the chosen leader, a man who had proven himself across many years in the hard testing of the desert, and who held his office not by inheritance and not by riches, but by the trust and the will of his people. The naib carried the weight of many decisions, of when the tribe would move and when it would rest, of how the water would be shared and how the disputes would be settled, and he carried this weight not as a distant ruler set above the others, but as the eldest and steadiest voice among equals, one who had earned the right to speak first by giving the most. A naib slept in the same rock as the humblest water carrier and ate the same spice-laced food, and knew every name and every family within the walls he guarded. Around the naib, the life of the sietch turned in a slow and steady rhythm, each person taking up the labor that suited their years and their strength. The men went out into the desert to ride the worms and to raid the enemies of the tribe and to tend the vast and secret works that the Fremen had begun in the deepest places. And when they returned, they laid down their burdens and took up the quieter tasks of the interior. The women held the heart of the sietch in their keeping, tending the storerooms and the nurseries and the long chambers where the children learned the ways of their people, and among the Fremen the wisdom and the counsel of women were prized and heeded, for the tribe knew well that its strength was carried forward in the hands of its mothers. The elders, whose bodies could no longer cross the open sand, gave their days to the crafts and the teaching and the remembering, weaving the still suits and the ropes, shaping the maker hooks and the fixed spears, and holding in their memories the long, unwritten history of the tribe. The children of the sietch were cherished and watched and trained from their earliest years, for they were the future of the tribe and the vessels of its continuance, and no child was ever without 100 watchful guardians in that close community. They learned to walk without rhythm across the sand so that the worms would not hear them, and they learned to seal their still suits and to breathe with care and to waste nothing of the water within their own small bodies. They played their games in the safe dark of the inner chambers, and they listened to the tales of the old ones, and little by little they grew into the discipline that the desert demanded, until the day came when each would take up a place among the workers and the riders and the keepers of the tribe. Deep within the sietch lay the storerooms, and these were the pride and the security of the people, for there the Fremen kept the fruits of their long and patient labor. There were chambers of dried food and chambers of woven cloth, of spice traded and spice hoarded, of tools and weapons, and the countless small things that a people needed to endure in a world that gave nothing freely. And there were the great sealed cisterns, hidden and guarded, of which the coming chapter will tell more. For the water of the tribe was its deepest treasure and its most closely held secret. The wealth of a sietch was measured not in coin, which meant little in the desert, but in what it had gathered and what it could withstand. And a rich sietch was one that could weather the longest drought and the hardest season without fear. The life within these walls was close and warm, and bound by 1,000 quiet customs, and it was in the sharing of these customs that the Fremen became not merely a gathering of families, but a single living thing. They gathered together to mark the passing of the seasons and the great turnings of their lives, and they held their rights in the assembly chambers, where the whole tribe could come together in one place. When a member of the tribe died, the water of that body was reclaimed with solemn ceremony and returned to the tribe that had raised and sheltered them, so that even in death a Fremen gave to the people the most precious gift they possessed, and no loss was ever wholly a loss, for the water endured and the tribe endured. In this way, the living and the dead alike belonged to one another, joined across the generations in a single, unbroken chain of obligation and care. And so within the cool dark of the rock the Fremen lived their hidden lives, disciplined and gentle among their own, fierce only toward the world outside that would have taken from them all they had built. The families slept close together in their curtained alcoves, and the storerooms held their patient wealth, and the glow globes drifted softly through the turning corridors, and above it all the open desert kept its ancient watch, giving no sign to any stranger of the great and living community that thrived beneath the sand. To belong to a sietch was to be never alone, to owe much, and to be owed much in return, to be held by the tribe, and to hold it up in turn, and it was this deep web of belonging, more than any weapon or any secret, that made the Fremen strong beyond the reckoning of all who ruled them from afar. Up next in Chapter 6, Water Discipline and the Tribe's Hoard, we'll drift down together into the guarded and glimmering heart of the sietch, to the great hidden cisterns where the water of a whole people lay gathered and still, and we'll learn in the same slow and easy way how the Fremen counted and kept and dreamed upon their most precious treasure of all. Chapter 6. Water Discipline and the Tribe's Hoard on a world where the sun rose like a hammer of white fire and the sand stretched onward for 1,000 leagues without so much as a single stream to break it. Water became the one thing that mattered above all others, and the people who lived upon that world came to hold it as sacred beyond any jewel or any weapon or any measure of. Spice. Arrakis, the desert planet, the place that offworlders called Dune, was a world of almost perfect dryness, a place where the very air seemed to drink the moisture from the skin of any who walked beneath the open sky, and it was here, in the deep sietches hidden within the rock, that the Fremen learned the oldest and most patient of all their disciplines, which was the discipline of water. To them, water was not a thing to be spent or spilled or wasted in the careless way of the wet worlds, but a treasure to be counted drop by gentle drop, remembered, guarded, and passed down through the long, unbroken line of the generations, as a wealth that belonged not to any one person, but to the whole of the tribe. In the sietch that you came to know in the chapter before, where the people gathered in their warm and lamplit halls of stone and lived their quiet, ordered lives far from the burning surface, this reverence for water shaped every hour of every day, so softly, and so completely that it became as natural to them as breathing. A child of the Fremen learned before he could walk that moisture was precious, and he learned it not through harsh words, but through the calm and steady example of everyone around him, who moved through the world with a care so deep that they seemed almost to hold their breath before the gift of a single tear. There was a saying among them, gentle and old, that the body of a person carried within it a small hidden reservoir of water, water enough to matter, water that must never be given lightly to the thirsty sand, and so they lived in a way that returned as much of that moisture to themselves and to their people as the world would allow. The most sacred of all their customs, and perhaps the one that revealed most clearly the softness that lay beneath the hardness of their desert lives, was the way in which they honored the water of the dead. When a person of the sietch came at last to the end of a long life, or fell in some far place upon the sand, the Fremen did not simply let that person go into the earth and forget them. Instead, they understood that the body still held its measure of precious moisture, and that this moisture belonged not to the one who had died, but to the tribe that had loved and sheltered and been strengthened by that person for all the years of their living. And so, with great tenderness and with a solemn quiet ceremony, they reclaimed the water from the bodies of their dead, so that the essence of one who had passed returned gently to the people, and flowed on into the lives of those who remained, and was carried forward into the long green dream that lay ahead. It was not a cold thing, nor a fearful thing, but a way of saying that no one was ever truly lost, that the water of a grandmother might one day pass into the strength of her grandchildren, and that the tribe was a single living body across all the reaches of time. Because water was so dear, the Fremen came in time to measure their wealth by it, and to trade in it in a manner unknown to any softer people. Among them there passed small rings, water rings they were called, and each ring stood for a fixed and known measure of water held safely in the great stores of the sietch. A person who carried many such rings upon a cord was counted rich, for those rings were the promise of life itself made small enough to hold in the palm of the hand, and they could be given in exchange for goods, offered as the price of a marriage, or set aside as the careful savings of a household. Yet even in this the Fremen kept their gentleness, for the counting of water was never a greedy thing, but a solemn and honest reckoning, a way of remembering how much life the tribe possessed, and of sharing it fairly among all who belonged to the family of the sietch. And where, you may wonder, did all this treasured water lie waiting, upon a world so dry that the open desert offered not one honest drop from horizon to horizon? The answer lay hidden deep within the rock, in the great secret cisterns that each sietch guarded as its dearest possession, far below the living halls, in chambers carved with patient labor across the slow turning of many years. The Fremen had gathered and stored their wealth of water, pool upon dark and silent pool, sealed away from the thirsty air and hidden utterly from the eyes of any who did not belong. These vast basins held more water than an off-worlder could easily believe, and their existence was one of the great secrets of the desert people, a secret so carefully kept that the lords who ruled the planet from their bright cities never dreamed of the riches that lay beneath the sand. To stand at the edge of such a cistern, in the cool and echoing dark, and to hear the soft whisper of so much gathered water, was for a Fremen a thing very near to prayer, for that quiet pool was the saved-up life of countless days of patience, the hoard of the tribe, the slow harvest of every drop that discipline had spared. Yet the most wondrous thing of all about this gathered water was not what it was, but what it was meant one day to become. For the Fremen did not hoard their water only to drink it and to live, though live they surely did. They held within their hearts a dream, secret and patient and older than any living memory, a dream carried quietly from parent to child across so many generations that no one could say when first it had been born. It was the dream of a green Arrakis, a dream of the day when the tribe would have gathered water enough, saved and guarded and reclaimed across the long, slow centuries to change the very face of their harsh and beautiful world. They imagined, in the soft privacy of their thoughts, a day when open water might one day lie beneath the open sky, when plants might grow upon the dunes and gentle grasses cover the places that had known only sand, when the terrible dryness would soften into something living and green and kind. This was the great and hidden hope that gave meaning to all their careful counting, and every ring of water, every reclaimed drop, every sealed and silent cistern was one more small and faithful step along the impossibly long road toward that promised world. And so the desert people lived, holding their water as one holds a sleeping child, measuring it with love, guarding it with patience, dreaming across the generations of a green world that their own eyes might never see, yet trusting that their children's children, or the children beyond even those, would one day walk beneath living trees upon the sand and know that it had been made possible by the quiet discipline of all who came before. It was a slow and gentle faith, unhurried as the turning of the stars, and it wrapped the whole of the tribe in a single shared and tender purpose that carried them softly through every long, dry day. Up next in Chapter 7, The Stillsuit and the Art of Survival, we'll drift out once more into the wide and open desert to see the wondrous garment that let a person walk beneath the burning sun, and we'll rest quietly among the clever and patient ways the Fremen learned to keep the precious water close, so that no drop of life was ever given needlessly to the thirsty sand. Chapter 7. The Stillsuit and the Art of Survival in the quiet that follows the discipline of water. When the mind has settled into the slow rhythm of a people who counted every drop as if it were a small and precious life, the thoughts drift naturally toward the wondrous garment that made all of that patience possible. For the Fremen did not merely ration their water and hoard it in sealed catch pockets deep within the rock. They wore an invention so clever and so complete that it turned the human body itself into a vessel of reclamation, a slow and steady still that gathered back the moisture a body would otherwise surrender to the burning air. This garment was called the Stillsuit, and to understand it is to understand how a person could walk out into the open sand of Arrakis, into the naked heat of the second sun, and live for days and even weeks where an off-worlder would perish within a single afternoon. Imagine the suit as it lay ready, a full body covering of many layers, each layer serving its own gentle purpose. Against the skin sat a micro-sandwich of fabric, a weave so fine and so patient that it drew away the perspiration the moment it formed, wicking it inward before it could bead upon the surface and rise as vapor into the thirsty desert wind. The heat regulation happened in that first layer, cool and quiet against the body, and the sweat that a person made through the long hours of walking was not lost, but carried onward, drawn through the porous middle of the suit toward the reclamation tissue that lay beyond. The Fremen understood that the body was always giving itself away in small invisible offerings, through the pores of the skin, through the breath, through every ordinary function of living, and the stillsuit was built to receive each of these offerings and return them, refined and clean, to the one who wore it. The breath itself was reclaimed. Across the face lay a soft catch tube fitted at the nostrils, and over the mouth a filter that gathered the warm moisture of each exhalation. For a person breathing out into dry air surrenders more water than one might ever guess. The suit collected this too, condensing the warmth of the breath and folding it back into the flowing store. There were plugs shaped gently for the nostrils, and clips to hold them, and a tube that ran down along the neck so that the wearer, when the store had gathered enough, could draw the reclaimed water up through a catch pocket by way of a simple tube at the collar, sipping slowly, quietly, without ever breaking the long, steady pace of the desert walk. Even the wastes of the body were not wasted. The lower reaches of the suit received them and processed them within the reclamation layers, separating the water that lived within them and adding it, cleansed, to the whole. Nothing was scorned, nothing was discarded. Everything the body released was gathered back, and this was the great secret of survival upon the sand. A still suit that was fitted well, snug and correct in every seam and seal, wasted no more than a thimbleful of moisture in a day. The old planetologist who studied Arrakis marveled at this, at how a person properly suited could live for a week or longer in the deep desert and lose almost nothing of themselves to the air. But the fitting mattered beyond all else, for a suit worn loose, with its seals gaping and its friction pads slipping, would sweat away its wearer's life without their ever knowing until the thirst came upon them. The Fremen fitted their suits with great care, checking the forehead pad, the closures at the arms and legs, the neck fitting that held the drinking tube, and a Fremen child learned the discipline of the suit almost before learning to walk far, for the suit was not a mere clothing, but a companion and a keeper of life. To wear it correctly was itself a quiet art, practiced until it became as natural as breathing, and the stillness with which the Fremen moved was in part the stillness the suit rewarded, for slow and measured motion made the least heat and the least sweat, and asked the least of the precious inner store. And when a person died at last, whether from age or from the hazards of that hard world, the water of their body was not permitted to return to the desert. The Fremen carried the dead to the death still, a solemn and sacred vessel kept within the sietch, and there the body was rendered gently down, and its water reclaimed, every measure of it counted, and set into the tribe's great catch basins deep beneath the rock. For the Fremen held that the water of a person belonged not to that person alone, but to the whole people, to the tribe that had shared its long thirst together, and to give one's water back to the community upon dying was regarded as the last and finest gift a Fremen could offer. The counting of that water was done with reverence, and the one who bore the water of the dead carried it as a trust, and in this way even death became a part of the slow gathering, the endless patient reclaiming that held the people alive. Around the still suit gathered a whole family of tools, each one born of long knowledge and shaped by the needs of the sand. There was the sand snork, a breathing tube that a person could push up through the surface when buried beneath the dunes, drawing clean air down into a pocket of safety while the storm raged above, or while hiding from an enemy's eyes. There was the paracompass, for the ordinary compass was useless upon a world whose magnetic field wandered and shifted, and so the Fremen carried instruments read against the local landmarks and the movements of the sky. There were the maker hooks, the long and reverent goads with which the boldest of the people would mount and steer the great sandworms across the open desert. A craft so daring it belongs to a later telling. There were static compaction tools for shaping the sand, and thumpers whose slow rhythmic beating called the makers from the deep, and the small pack of a desert traveler held everything needed to endure, all of it light, all of it certain, all of it learned by heart. And there was the krisk knife, the sacred blade of the Fremen, milk white and slightly curved, ground and shaped from the crystalline tooth of one of the great sandworms of Arrakis. Each crysknife was drawn from a maker, from the vast creatures that ruled the deep desert, and to hold one was to hold a piece of the very power that shaped that world. The blade was a thing of honor and of secrecy, unfixed or fixed according to its making, treated always with a gravity that outsiders could scarcely comprehend, for it was more than a weapon. It was a bond between the people and the desert that had birthed them, a token of the maker whose tooth it had once been, carried close and kept clean and never shone lightly. In all of these things, in the layered suit and the quiet tools and the sacred blade, there lived the same patient truth. The Fremen had not conquered their world by force, for no force could master a desert so vast and so unforgiving. They had learned it instead, slowly, generation upon generation, until the lethal sand became a home, until the killing heat became a thing one walked through calmly in a well-fitted suit, until the desert that would slay a stranger in a day became the cradle of a strong and enduring people. That knowledge was their true wealth, gathered as carefully as their water, passed down as gently as a whispered blessing from the old to the young. Up next in Chapter 8, Riding the Great Sandworms, we'll walk out with the boldest of the Fremen onto the open dunes and learn in the same slow and soothing way how a people came to summon and mount the mightiest creatures of Arrakis. So let your breathing settle and your thoughts grow soft as we rest here a while longer. Chapter 8. Riding the Great Sandworms, when a Fremen finished sealing the last catch and flap of a stillsuit, when the body was at last wrapped and cradled and kept from losing even a single breath of its own moisture to the wide and thirsty air, there remained one more thing that bound a person to the deep desert of Arrakis, and it was the greatest thing of all. It was not a garment, and it was not a tool, and it was not a place of hiding among the rocks. It was a living creature, vast beyond the easy reach of the imagination, moving somewhere far beneath the dunes in the warm and silent dark, and the Fremen loved it and feared it, and called it by a name that carried the weight of worship. They called it Shai Hulud, which meant the Great Maker, the Old Man of the Desert, the grandfather who was there before the tribes and who would be there long after them, and to speak the name softly was almost to pray. The sandworms of Arrakis were the largest living things that anyone had ever seen, and the deep desert belonged to them the way the sea belongs to the whales that pass through it. Some of the greatest makers were hundreds of meters long, longer than the longest towers that people had ever built, so long that a person standing at one end could not have told with any certainty where the far end lay. Their bodies were ringed and segmented, band after band of thick and armored skin, and their round mouths opened like the mouths of caves, lined with rows and rows of crystal teeth that turned in slow patient wheels. When a worm rose to the surface, it did not so much appear as arrive, pushing the sand upward into a long swelling mound, and then breaking through in a slow towering climb that lifted tons of desert into the moonlight and let it pour back down in soft and endless streams. To watch such a thing from a safe high place was to feel very small and very quiet and strangely at peace, the way one feels when watching a storm move far out across the water. The Fremen believed, and they were entirely right to believe, that the great worms were the makers of the spice, the source of that precious substance called melange that lay hidden in the sand and gave long life and clear sight to those who took it. In some deep and unhurried way that tied the beginning of the cycle to its end, the worm and the spice and the desert were all one single thing, one great slow-breathing being, and the worm was its heart. And so when a Fremen looked out across the endless dunes and saw the tracks of a maker, a long trembling line drawn across the sand, that person did not feel only fear, though fear was there, and did not feel only awe, though awe was there as well. That person felt something closer to the love a child feels for a grandfather who is both gentle and terrible, both the giver of every good thing and the keeper of a power far too great to ever be truly held. Now here is the wonder at the center of it all, the thing that set the Fremen apart from every other people who had ever tried to live upon that harsh and golden world. The Fremen had learned, across long generations of patient watching and quiet daring, how to call the great worms to them, and how to climb upon their vast ringed backs, and how to ride them across the open desert as easily as other people might ride a horse across a meadow. It was a thing that no outsider believed until they saw it with their own astonished eyes, and even then it seemed more like a dream than a memory. The calling began with a small and simple device that the Fremen named a thumper. It was little more than a stake driven into the sand with a spring inside it and a clapper that beat steadily against the ground. Thump and thump and thump, a slow, patient heartbeat sent down into the dark. The worms of Arrakis could not bear a rhythm that was not their own, and any steady drumming upon the sand drew them from far away, curious and hungry and vast, gliding up through the deep to find the source of the sound. So a Fremen would set the thumper going, and then walk calmly a little distance away and wait, standing loose and easy upon the sand, listening for the first faint hiss that meant a maker was coming. When the worm rose, it came in a rush of parting sand, and the ground shook with the nearness of it, and the Fremen who meant to ride it did a thing that seemed at first to be pure madness, and was in truth the highest of all their skills. Running lightly along the moving flank of the creature, the rider reached out with a set of long hooks, the maker hooks, and drove them gently in beneath the front edge of one of the great ringed segments, and pulled so that a fold of the soft skin between two rings was held open to the air. Now the worm would not roll that tender place down into the abrasive sand, for the sand was harsh against the exposed and sensitive flesh, and so the great creature lifted that part of itself upward and turned, rolling its whole immense length so that the open segment rode high and clear, away from the ground. And in doing so, it lifted the rider high as well, up onto the broad curving back, up above the dunes into the moving air, and there the Fremen stood, small and steady upon a living mountain, and steered it where they wished by holding open one side or the other with the hooks. The worm, patient and enormous and unwilling to be scoured by the sand, would run for hours across the desert, tiring at last, and carry its riders swift and silent over distances that no walker could ever hope to cross. To learn this art was the great passage into Fremen adulthood, the rite that turned a child of the sietch into a full and rightful member of the tribe. A young person might grow up strong and clever and wise in all the ways of water and shelter and survival, but until they had called their own maker and mounted it and ridden it under the open sky and returned again to the rocks, they were not yet counted among the grown. And so the first ride was remembered by every Fremen for the whole length of their life, the fear of it and the trembling of it, and then the sudden wide astonishment of standing upon the back of a god and feeling it carry them, the desert unrolling on every side, the wind clean and dry against the mask, the vast, slow strength of the creature moving beneath their feet like the swell of a warm and endless sea. There was in all of this a balance that lay at the very center of what it meant to be Fremen, a threefold weaving of reverence and fear and mastery that no single word could hold. They revered the worm as a living god and would never harm a great one, for to slay a full-grown maker was a thing beyond thinking. They feared it truly, for it could swallow a person and a whole crawling machine in a single unhurried gulp, and no wall and no weapon could stop it once it rose. And yet they had mastered it, gently and cleverly, not by breaking its will, but by working softly with its own deep nature, so that the same creature that could destroy them entire would instead carry them home. To hold all three of those feelings at once, the love and the dread and the quiet sure skill, was to understand the desert itself and to belong to it as the Fremen belonged, all the way down to the bone. And so, wrapped in the still suit and carried on the back of the Maker, the Fremen moved through their world as no other people ever could, at home, in a place that killed the unwary within a single day. Rest now, and let the great slow shape of Shai-Hulud pass gently through your mind, vast and patient and calm beneath the moonlit sand. Up next in Chapter 9, Fremen religion and the Sayadina will drift softly into the deep and gentle faith of the desert people, the beliefs they carried in their hearts, and the wise women who tended those beliefs like a small and steady flame. Chapter 9. Fremen religion and the Sayadina. When the great worm had at last carried its riders far across the open sand and slipped away again beneath the dunes, spent and settling into the deep, there remained in the hearts of the Fremen something far older than the ride itself, something that had been passed down through countless generations of hidden people, and that something was faith. For the Fremen of Arrakis did not simply survive upon the desert as a traveler survives a hardship that will one day end. They lived inside the desert as a devout soul lives inside a prayer, and every grain of sand, every ripple of heat rising from the pan, every silence that lay upon the open bled, was to them a part of a vast and holy design. Their religion was not a thing they wore on certain days and set aside on others. It was the very breath in their chests, woven so tightly into the labor of their days and the rest of their nights that no Fremen could have told you where the keeping of water ended and the keeping of the spirit began, for to them these were one single devotion. Their faith had come with them across the long dark reaches of time, carried from world to world by wandering ancestors, and it bore the deep quiet mark of the old Zensuni ways. These were the beliefs of a people who had once been fugitives and slaves upon distant planets, a people who had turned inward, away from the noise of empires, and had learned to seek the divine in patience and in submission, and in the slow inward journey of the contemplative soul. When at last these wanderers came to the burning world of Arrakis and made their home in the caves and the sinks and the sheltered basins of the deep desert, their gentle inward faith met the terrible honesty of the sand, and the two grew together into something new. The softness of the old Zensuni prayers took on the hard edge of a world that gave nothing freely, and the desert in turn was made sacred by the reverence the people brought to it. At the center of all their belief coiled the great worm, Shai-Hulud, whom they named the Old Man of the Desert and the Grandfather and the Maker of the Sand. To the outworlder the worm was a monstrous beast, a peril to be feared and avoided. But to the Fremen it was far more than a creature of appetite and motion. Shai-Hulud was a living god who moved through the deep, and the Fremen believed that in the vast body of the worm dwelt a power that had shaped their world and that watched, in its slow and patient way, over the fate of the tribes. They did not worship the worm with loud song or with towers of stone, for they had neither the water nor the safety for such display. Instead, they honored it with a reverence held close and quiet in the heart, and they spoke its name softly. And when they carved its likeness into their tools and their shrines, they did so with the tenderness of children remembering a stern and beloved elder. In their oldest teachings, the worm and the sand and the precious spice were bound together in a single sacred mystery, 3 faces of one great truth that no single mind could hold entire. Guiding the people in the keeping of these mysteries were the holy women whom the Fremen called the Sayadina. These were the priestesses of the tribe, the friends of God, the women set apart to tend the rites and to carry the old words faithfully from one generation to the next. A Sayadina walked among her people not as a ruler, but as a keeper, and her hands were trusted with the most solemn of the tribe's ceremonies. It was she who spoke the ancient forms over the gathered sietch, she who blessed the union of a man and a woman, she who tended the passing of the dead and saw that the sacred water within a fallen brother or sister was returned with honor to the tribe. The Sayadina held in her memory the long chain of ritual words, learned in patient years of study, and through her the past reached forward and touched the present, so that no child born in the deep desert grew up a stranger to the faith of the ancestors. Above the Sayadina, and yet grown from among their number, stood the Reverend Mother, who was the deepest well of the tribe's remembrance. The Fremen believed that a people who forgot their past would perish as surely as a people who lost their water, and so they had found a way to keep the memory of the tribe alive in a single living vessel. The Reverend Mother carried within her not only her own life, but the gathered lives of all the Reverend Mothers who had come before her, an unbroken inward river of remembered voices reaching back into the mist of the wandering years. When one who bore this burden felt her death drawing near, she would call to her a chosen Sayadina, and there would pass between them, in a final and sacred sharing, the whole weight of that ancient inheritance, so that nothing would be lost and the long chain would hold. The passage into this office came through an ordeal, both perilous and holy, and it turned upon the substance the Fremen named the water of life. This was a thing drawn from the very body of a young worm, a liquid of terrible potency that would slay an ordinary person outright, and yet within it lay the key to the Great Awakening. A woman who was to become a Reverend Mother would take this poison into herself, and by an inward power learned in long preparation, she would change it within her own body, transforming that which brought death into that which brought vision. In the trance that followed, she would open at last to the flood of the past, and the memories of all the mothers before her would rush into her waking mind and become her own. It was an ordeal that the Fremen held in the deepest awe, for it stood upon the very border between death and life, and only the strongest and most prepared of women could pass through it and return whole. When the ceremony was shared with the wider tribe, the transformed water would be passed among the gathered people, and in that communion a strange unity would settle over the sietch, a sense of many minds drawn for a moment into one great and ancient soul. The ceremonies of water and of death lay at the heart of Fremen worship, for on Arrakis water was life itself and could never be spent without meaning. When a Fremen died, the tribe did not mourn with wasteful grief, but reclaimed the water of the body for the living, counting it a sacred trust, and the number of that reclaimed water was spoken aloud, so that all might know the worth of the one who had gone. In this way, even death was folded into the great cycle of keeping, and no drop and no life was ever truly lost to the people. Through all of these rites there ran a thread of quiet expectation, a whisper carried in the oldest songs and the deepest teachings, the belief that one day there would come to the desert a voice from the outer world, a leader born of the far reaches who would take up the burden of the Fremen and lead them into a green and gentle paradise. This hope slept within their faith like a seed within the sand, patient and unhurried, waiting for the season of its rising, and the Fremen tended it across the long centuries with the same faithful care they gave to their hidden pools of water. Up next in Chapter 10, The Seeds of the Missionaria Protectiva, we'll follow that quiet thread of prophecy back to its unexpected source and drift gently into the long and secret work of those who in ages past had sown the deserts of far worlds with the very legends the Fremen now held so dear. Chapter 10. The Seeds of the Missionaria Protectiva. To understand the deepest currents of Fremen belief, one must travel far back in time, long before the first sietch was carved into the rock of Arrakis, long before the desert people learned to walk without rhythm so that the great worms would not hear them. One must look toward the quiet halls of the Bene Gesserit, that ancient sisterhood of trained women who moved through the affairs of the Imperium like shadows behind a curtain, patient and unseen, working always for ends that stretched across many lifetimes. For it was the sisterhood, centuries earlier, who had gently placed within Fremen faith a set of seeds, and those seeds, planted with such care and such foresight, would grow slowly across generations until they blossomed into something the sisters themselves could scarcely have imagined. The program that carried these seeds was known as the Missionaria Protectiva, and its purpose was as calm and deliberate as a gardener choosing where the soil will best hold a young root. The sisterhood understood that a Bene Gesserit traveling alone among strange and distant peoples might one day find herself in terrible danger, cut off from her order, surrounded by those who did not know her and might not wish her well. And so, long in advance, upon many scattered worlds, they sowed protective myths and reassuring superstitions into the local beliefs, weaving them so softly into the fabric of custom and prayer that the people who held them came to feel they had always been there. These implanted legends were like doors left unlocked in a far country, waiting quietly for the right traveler to arrive and simply push them open. On Arrakis, among the Fremen of the deep desert, the Missionaria Protectiva had done its work with special patience, and the seeds had taken root in the driest and most enduring soil of all, the soil of a people who lived close to death, and who therefore held tightly to hope. The sisterhood had left behind the legend of a coming one, a figure who would appear from beyond the known worlds to lead the desert folk toward their deliverance. The Fremen came to call this awaited one by several names, each name a gentle echo of the prophecy that had been settled among them. They spoke of the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, one who would come not from Arrakis itself, but from some distant place beyond the stars, carrying knowledge that the desert could not have given him. And they spoke also of the Mahdi, the one who would guide them, who would take them by the hand across the long years and lead them at last toward the paradise their hearts had learned to long for. It is worth pausing here to feel the shape of what the sisterhood had done, for there is a deep and quiet mystery within it. The Bene Gesserit had not conquered the Fremen with armies, nor bound them with chains, nor ruled them from any throne. They had simply given them a story, a promise held in the mind, and passed from mother to child across the slow turning of the generations, and that story would prove stronger and more lasting than any fortress of stone. A myth, planted well, needs no soldiers to defend it. It lives in the telling and the retelling, in the songs sung softly in the sietch, in the words a grandmother speaks to a sleepy child, and it grows deeper roots with every passing year until it becomes indistinguishable from truth itself. The prophecies had certain shapes to them, certain patterns that the sisterhood had woven in with great care, and these patterns were designed to be recognized, The people were taught to look for particular signs, to expect that the awaited one would arrive knowing things he ought not to know, speaking words that the old legends had already spoken, moving through the sacred rites as though he had always belonged to them. A woman of the sisterhood, or a child of the sisterhood, arriving among the Fremen in some hour of need, might find that the desert people already held ready in their hearts a place shaped exactly to receive her. She would need only to speak the remembered phrases, to fulfill the expected forms, and the fear in Fremen eyes would soften into wonder, and the wonder into devotion, and the devotion into a loyalty that would give its life without hesitation. So the seeds lay waiting, generation after generation, quiet beneath the surface of Fremen faith like water hidden deep beneath the sand. The people who carried the legends did not know their origin. They did not remember that the promise had been shaped from afar by careful hands with careful purposes. To them, the prophecy was ancient and holy, older than memory. A gift handed down from the earliest days of their wandering. They cherished it and guarded it and taught it to their young, never suspecting that the words they held so dear had been placed among them long ago as a kind of shelter, a hidden refuge prepared for a traveler who had not yet come. And this is one of the strange and gentle ironies of that far time, that a faith so deeply and truly felt should have been shaped, in part, by influences from beyond the world it belonged to. There is a kindness in the sisterhood's design that sits beside its cunning, and the two are not easy to separate. The Missionaria Protectiva was, in one sense, a tool, a means of protecting the sisters who ventured into dangerous places, and in that sense it was cold and calculating and made without sentiment. Yet the myths it planted also gave comfort to those who received them, offering hope to a people who lived in a hard and unforgiving land, giving them something to wait for, something to trust, a light held up against the long darkness of the desert nights. The seeds were sown for the sisterhood's own protection, and yet they became a true and living part of Fremen hearts, and the desert people were the richer for their hoping, whatever the origin of that hope may have been. And so the meaning of these implanted prophecies must be held in two hands at once, gently, without forcing them to be only one thing or the other. The legends were both genuine and constructed, both a native treasure of the Fremen and a distant gift from the sisterhood, both a source of true comfort and a quiet instrument of purpose. A trained outsider, arriving one day upon Arrakis with knowledge of these very legends, might find in them a ready path into the trust of the desert people, might speak the words the prophecy had prepared, and watch a whole people turn toward him, as flowers turn toward the sun. Such a one would need only to recognize the doors that the Missionaria Protectiva had left unlocked so long before, and to step through them, and the deep faith of the Fremen would carry him the rest of the way. For now it is enough to rest in the wonder of it, in the thought of those seeds lying patient beneath the sand of belief, planted by hands that were long gone, waiting through centuries of quiet nights for a season that had not yet arrived. The desert kept its secrets, and the legends kept theirs, and the Fremen went on cherishing a hope whose beginnings they had long forgotten, and all of it moved slowly toward a moment still hidden far ahead in the folds of time. There is a peace in imagining it, a peace like the peace of sleep, in which everything is prepared and everything is waiting, and nothing yet needs to happen. Up next, in Chapter 11, the Fremen and the Spice will drift softly into the golden heart of Arrakis and follow the precious spice melange from the depths of the sand into the lives, the eyes, and the very dreams of the desert people who loved it. The seeds of the Missionaria Protectiva had drifted down onto Arrakis long ago and taken quiet root in the hearts of the desert people. And yet there was another thing woven into those same hearts that no order of women had planted there, a thing older and stranger and far more intimate, and that thing was the spice. To understand the Fremen at all, one had to understand that they did not merely live upon a world that happened to hold the most precious substance in the known universe. They lived inside the spice, breathed it, ate it, dreamed within it, and carried it in the very fluids of their bodies, so that there was in the end no clear line between the people and the melange that saturated their sand. Let your breathing slow now, and let the warm cinnamon hush of that idea settle over you like fine dust settling after a long and windless night. Everywhere on Arrakis the spice was present, and the Fremen knew this the way a fish knows water, which is to say hardly at all and completely at once. It rose from the deep desert on the wind, a faint sweet bite in the air that a stranger might notice for a day and then forget, but that lay upon the Fremen from the hour of their birth to the hour of their death. It was in the paste they spread upon their flatbread, and in the strong dark drink they warmed over small blue flames within the sietch. It was in the fabric of their days and the fabric of their tents, in the small cakes carried on long journeys, and in the deep stores sealed away against lean seasons. A child born in the caverns of the deep desert took the spice with its first meal, and never afterward went a single day without it, and so the melange became not a luxury, nor even quite a food, but something closer to the air itself, a thing assumed and unremarked, and utterly essential. Because of this, the eyes of the Fremen changed. Over years of constant spice, the whites of their eyes darkened and deepened until there was no white left at all, and the whole eye became a rich and glowing blue, blue upon blue, iris and pupil and sclera all drowned in the same deep color. This was the mark that the Outworlders called the eyes of the Ibad, and among the Fremen it was simply the ordinary look of a grown person, as unremarkable to them as it was startling to a visitor from the soft green worlds. A child's eyes might still hold a rim of paler shade, but by the time that child had walked the sand for a handful of seasons, the blue had closed over everything, and to look into a Fremen's eyes was to look into two small pools of the desert night. It was beautiful in a way that no one within the sietch thought to name, for they saw it in every face around them, in the elders and the water-bearers and the sleeping children, a whole people gazing out at their harsh bright world through eyes the color of deep and quiet water. The spice did more than color them. It settled into their bodies and made a gentle claim there, a mild and lifelong dependence that bound them softly to the melange as surely as thirst bound them to their stores of water. A Fremen who was cut off from the spice for too long would begin to fail, would sicken and weaken, for the body had grown to expect the substance and to build itself around it. Yet this was not the wild and ruinous craving of some poison, for the spice gave far more than it took. It lengthened their years and quickened their senses and lifted a fine veil from the edges of their awareness, so that they moved through the desert with a heightened and steady sharpness, reading the sand and the wind and the small signs of life with a clarity that the unspiced could never quite match. The melange was at once their necessity and their gift, a chain that was also a pair of wings, and the Fremen carried it lightly, the way a person carries the beating of their own heart, and the Fremen understood, as no scholar of the great houses ever fully did, where the spice truly came from. They knew the long, slow cycle of it, the hidden turning of things beneath the dunes that made the melange rise. They knew of the little makers, the small, half-grown worms that lived in the sand, and of the sand trout, the leathery, flat creatures that gathered the desert's water away into deep basins far below, sealing it off from the surface so that Arrakis stayed dry and the great worms might live. They knew that where a mass of pre-spice gathered deep down, a bubble of water, and the leavings of the little makers ripening together in the dark, there would in time come a swelling and a bursting, a spice blow that flung the melange up into the open air where the sun could work upon it. And they knew that the great sandworms, the vast makers they called Shai Hulud, were the little makers grown to their full and terrible size, so that the worm and the spice and the water and the sand were all one single circle, each thing becoming the next in a patient dance that had turned since long before any human foot had touched the planet. To the Fremen, the spice was not a mystery to be dug from the ground and sold. It was the visible sign of a living world, the sweet exhalation of the desert's own slow breathing. Because the spice touched everything, it touched the tribe most deeply of all in the hours when the people gathered together. In the deep of the sietch, on the nights of ceremony and of grief and of joy, the Fremen would come into one another's presence and share the concentrated essence of the melange. And in that sharing something happened that words could barely hold. Their separate awarenesses would soften at the edges and lean toward one another, and for a while the tribe would move as a single feeling thing, a communion they called the Tao, the deep oneness of the sietch. In the Tao, the boundaries between one person and the next grew thin, and old wounds were eased and quarrels forgotten, and the whole gathered people breathed and swayed and knew themselves as one body with one long memory. This was not a thing done lightly nor often, but it lay at the very center of who they were, the spice gathering the many into the one and then releasing them again. Each person carried a little way outside the walls of their own skull and sat down softly among their brothers and sisters. Let that gentle image drift through you now, a whole people breathing as one in the warm dark, held together by the sweet substance of their world. And here was the strangest and quietest wonder of all. While the Fremen lived so intimately with the spice, folding it into their bread and their eyes and their communions, the vast machinery of empires turned and burned in the black gulfs between the stars over this very same substance. Great houses schemed and fell over it. Navigators of the guild folded space itself by breathing it. The whole trade of 1,000 worlds rested upon it, and fleets and fortunes and dynasties rose and shattered for the sake of the melange. Yet all of that thunder passed far away and unheard above the dunes, while the desert people simply lived, gathering their little cakes and warming their dark drink and gazing out through blue on blue eyes at the sand that gave them everything. They possessed the most valuable thing in the universe not as a treasure locked in a vault, but as the ordinary substance of their lives, and they held it without greed and without wonder, the way a person holds the ground they stand upon. Rest now, and let the quiet of that thought cover you, the desert people and their spice, unhurried and unafraid beneath the wheeling stars. Up next in Chapter 12, Liet Kynes and the Dream of a Green Arrakis, we'll follow a single quiet visionary who looked out over all this endless sand and dared to imagine, slowly and patiently across long generations, a desert one day softened into gardens and open water. Chapter 12. Liet Kynes and the Dream of a Green Arrakis. The Fremen had lived with the spice and the sand for a very long time, and in the quiet of their sietches they had carried an old and secret longing, a longing so gentle and so deep that few of them could have put it into plain words. It was the wish for water that would not have to be hoarded drop by drop, the wish for a world where a child might one day stand in an open field and feel the cool of green leaves against the skin, And this wish had lived in them the way a seed lives in the dry ground, waiting through season after season for the smallest touch of moisture. Into this ancient waiting there came a man who would gather all those scattered hopes and give them a shape, a plan, and a patience wide enough to last for centuries, and his name was Paul, and after him his son Liet, and together, across 2 long lifetimes, they taught the desert people to dream with open eyes. Paul had come to Arrakis as an imperial planetologist sent by the throne to study the sands and the spice and to report on the strange living machinery of the world, and he had arrived expecting to find only barrenness, a place of heat and dust and death. Yet as he walked among the dunes and knelt to study the soil and watched the way the wind carried its fine cargo of grit across the endless slopes, he began to see something that the Empire had never noticed, which was that Arrakis was not truly dead at all, but only sleeping, and that beneath its dryness there lay the slow breathing of a system that could, with the gentlest and most patient care, be coaxed toward abundance. He saw the little creatures that survived in the shadow of the rocks and the hardy plants that clung to life at the desert margins, and he understood that where life held on so stubbornly, life could also be encouraged to spread. It was Paul who first spoke to the Fremen, not as a stranger studying them, but as a man who shared their longing, and something remarkable happened in those early meetings. For the Fremen who had guarded their secrets so carefully for so long began to open their hearts to him. He told them that their world could be changed, that the desert did not have to remain a desert forever, and that with knowledge and labor and a patience measured in generations, Arrakis itself might one day wear a coat of green. To a people who had learned to treasure a single tear, this was a vision of almost unbearable beauty, and yet Paul did not offer it as a miracle or a gift from the sky. He offered it, instead, as a task, a great slow work that they themselves would carry out, hand by hand and dune by dune, and in this way he gave their ancient dream a method and turned a longing into a plan. The heart of the plan was water, and the gathering of water, held and hidden and multiplied across the long years until at last there would be enough to change the very climate of the world. Paul taught the Fremen to think of every drop as a treasure to be invested rather than merely saved, and he showed them how to read the small signs of moisture in the air and in the ground, and how to build the quiet machinery that would trap the faint dampness of the desert night. Across the dunes they began to place their dew collectors, small and smooth and cunningly shaped, so that in the cold hours before dawn the moisture of the air would gather upon them and run down in tiny threads to be caught and kept. And although each collector gathered only a little, there were to be a great many of them, and together, over time, their little gifts would add and add until they became a river hidden in the sand. When Paul died, his work did not die with him, for he had a son, and that son grew up among the Fremen and became one of them in his heart and in his ways, and the people gave him the name Liet, and in time they came to speak of him with a reverence that was almost like love. Liet carried both worlds within himself, for he wore the mantle of the imperial planetologist that his father had held, moving through the corridors of power as a servant of the throne, and yet beneath that role he was wholly Fremen, sworn to the secret dream and to the desert people who had raised him. In him the two halves of the great work were joined, the patient science of measurement and study on the one side, and on the other the fierce and quiet devotion of a people who would give their lives for a paradise they would never see, and this joining made him a leader of a rare and gentle kind. Liet gave the Fremen more than instructions, for he gave them a shared understanding of why each small act mattered. And this was perhaps the greatest of his gifts. He taught them the slow arithmetic of change, showing them how a single planting of tough and thirsty grass upon a stretch of open sand could hold that sand in place and keep it from blowing free, and how, once the sand was held, other and softer plants might one day take root in its shelter, and how each of these in turn would draw and hold a little more moisture, so that the desert, step by patient step, might be persuaded to yield. He set the Fremen to planting these hardy grasses in the high and hidden places, in the sinks and the basins where the wind was gentler, and he taught them to nurse each planting with a care that was almost tender, for every blade that survived was a small victory in a war, measured not in days or years, but in the long unfolding of centuries. And so, across the great desert of Arrakis there, grew a secret work that the Empire never saw, a work carried out in the deep sietches and upon the sheltered slopes, where the Fremen labored season after season at the slow transformation of their world. They gathered the dew and stored the water. They planted the grasses and tended the fragile margins where green struggled against the sand. And they passed their knowledge and their hope from parent to child, so that the plan would outlive every hand that touched it. They understood, because Liet Kynes had helped them to understand, that they themselves would most likely never walk beneath the open trees or feel the rain upon their faces, and yet they worked on, content to lay the foundations of a paradise that lay far ahead, a gift they were preparing for grandchildren they would never meet. There was a deep and quiet joy in this labor, the joy of belonging to something far larger than a single life, and in the calm of the desert nights, the Fremen could look out across the moonlit dunes and see, in their minds, the green world that was coming. They could picture the open water lying still beneath the sky, and the fields of grass bending softly in a wind that carried the smell of growing things, and the children of some distant age who would play in that gentle land and would never know the thirst that their ancestors had known. It was a dream held with patience and with love, and it made the harshness of the present easier to bear. For every Fremen who trapped a drop of water or planted a single blade of grass knew that he was reaching forward across the centuries to touch that far and shining day. Up next in Chapter 13, Stilgar and the Naibs of the sietches will drift gently into the deep desert communities where the Fremen made their homes, and will rest for a while beside the wise and steady leaders who guarded these hidden places and held their people together through the long, patient years. Chapter 13. Stilgar and the Naibs of the sietches far out beyond the reach of the great houses and their polished corridors, past the last outpost where the imperial banners hung limp in the heat. The deep desert of Arrakis kept its own quiet order, and at the heart of that order stood the Fremen, and at the heart of the Fremen stood men like Stilgar, Naib of Sietch Tabor, whose name was spoken among the tribes with a low and steady respect. He was a man of the desert in every fibre, lean and weathered as the rock itself, his eyes gone that deep and total blue that came from a lifetime of breathing the spice, and when he moved among his people, there was no hurry in him, only the certainty of someone who had crossed the sands 1,000 times and knew the price of every step. To the outsiders of the Imperium, he might have seemed only another wild wanderer of the wastes, but within the sietches he was known as a leader of rare wisdom, one whose judgment had settled many quarrels and whose courage had never once been questioned. And it is with him, and with the grave and dignified world of the Naibs, that this gentle chapter of our long night now rests. A Naib, in the old tongue and the older custom of the Fremen, was the chosen chief of a sietch. And to understand the Naib is to understand something patient and deeply fair about the way these desert people lived. He was not born to his place, nor granted it by any distant emperor, nor purchased with coin, for the Fremen held such things in quiet disregard. A Naib rose to leadership by strength and by wisdom, by proving over long years that he could keep his people alive in a land that forgave nothing, and above all by the consent of the tribe, for a chief who had lost the trust of those he led had lost the very ground on which he stood. In this way, authority among the Fremen was a living thing, held in the open hands of the whole community, given freely to the one who had earned it, and withdrawn, should he ever fail the sacred trust of water and honor that bound them all together. Stilgar had earned that trust many times over, and he carried it lightly, the way strong men carry heavy things. He led Sietch Tabr not by fear, but by the slow accumulation of respect, guiding the hunts for spice, ordering the careful tending of the hidden wind traps and the great catch basins where every precious drop of moisture was gathered and kept, and settling the disputes of families with a fairness that left even the losing side unshamed. Under his care, the sietch was a place of discipline and of warmth, where children learned the ways of the sand from their earliest years, where the old were honored for the water of their wisdom, and where each person understood their place within the whole without ever being made to feel small. This was the quiet miracle of Fremen leadership, that it bound so many wills into one purpose while leaving each soul its dignity intact. Yet no single sietch stood alone against the vastness of Arrakis, and here we come to one of the most remarkable things about these desert folk. For scattered across thousands of miles of dune and rock lay many sietches, each hidden deep within the mountains and the broken lands, each with its own Naib and its own people, and though they were separated by great distances and by the constant peril of the open sand, they were not divided in spirit. When matters touched all the tribes, the Naibs would gather in a council, coming together across the desert to speak and to listen, to weigh the concerns of the whole Fremen nation, and to reach decisions that no single chief could make alone. In these councils, Stilgar was a voice of particular weight, for his judgment was trusted far beyond the borders of his own sietch, and when he spoke, the other Naibs leaned in to hear him, knowing that his words were never wasted and never lightly given. The coordination of the sietches was a thing of great subtlety, carried on quietly beneath the notice of the rulers who imagined the desert empty. Messages passed from tribe to tribe by trusted riders, and by the old signals of the sand, water was shared in secret between sietches in times of need, and a common understanding held them all. So that though each community governed itself, the whole Fremen people moved with a hidden unity, like the many roots of a single deep and patient plant. The Naibs kept this unity alive through their gatherings, through the bonds of marriage and of shared blood that ran between the sietches, and through their shared reverence for the customs that had carried their ancestors safely through countless generations upon this harshest of worlds. Among those customs, few were held in graver regard than the Tahadi challenge, the formal contest by which a Fremen might dispute the leadership of another, and it is worth resting on this a while, for in it we see something of the seriousness with which these people held the matter of who should lead them. The Tahadi was no casual thing, entered into on a whim, but a solemn rite bound by strict and ancient rules, a challenge that one might raise when he believed himself worthy to take up the burden that another carried. Because leadership among the Fremen was earned and not merely inherited, this custom kept the strength of the tribe honest, ensuring that those who led were truly the fittest to lead, and it was surrounded by such gravity and such respect that it was never undertaken lightly by any who understood its weight. Stilgar himself had come to his place through the long proving of his worth, and he honored these customs as the very bones of Fremen life, the disciplines that kept his people strong across the ages. And underlying all of it, beneath the counsels and the challenges and the careful sharing of the sietches, ran the great current of Fremen honor, and above all their reverence for water. In a land where moisture was more precious than any jewel of the Imperium, the Fremen held the water of a man to be almost sacred, and their reckoning of honor was woven through with this reverence, so that debts of water and debts of blood were remembered and repaid with the utmost seriousness. To lead such a people required not only strength of arm, but a deep and unshakable honor, and this Stilgar possessed in full measure, so that his authority rested upon the certainty that his word, once given, was as fixed as the mountains of the shield wall. It was into this dignified and disciplined world that the young heir of the Atreides would one day come, and Stilgar would prove to be the bridge between the fallen house and the hidden people of the sand. For all his formidable strength and his position as one of the most respected leaders of the desert, Stilgar carried within him a rare and generous capacity to recognize greatness in another, and in time he would become mentor to the young Paul, teaching him the ways of the sietch and the sand, and then, as the years turned, he would become his devoted follower. That a naib of such standing could offer his loyalty so completely, without losing one measure of his own dignity, tells us much about the depth of the man and about the noble character of the people he led. A people who gave their trust slowly, and, once given, held to it with the patience of the deep desert itself. And so the night carries us onward, past the hidden sietches and their quiet councils, past the grave customs of the nabes and the deep blue eyes of Stilgar, keeping his patient watch over Sietch Tabor. Up next in Chapter 14, the coming of the Mahdi, will drift softly into the ancient dream that stirred within the Fremen heart, the long-awaited prophecy of a voice from the outer world, and the gentle unfolding of how a desert people came to wait for the one who would lead them home. Chapter 14. The coming of the Mahdi in the quiet hours after the nabes had gathered in the deep sietch, when Stilgar had spoken his measured words and the assembled leaders had drifted back into the shadowed corridors of their hidden homes, a older and gentler current continued to move beneath the surface of Fremen life, and that current was the long and patient waiting for the one who had been promised. It was a waiting that had no beginning that any living person could name, for it reached back across the centuries like a thread of water running beneath the sand, unseen and unbroken, carrying with it the hopes of countless generations who had lived and died upon the harsh face of Arrakis without ever seeing the fulfillment they so tenderly desired. The Fremen called this promised one by many names, and each name carried its own soft weight of meaning. They spoke of the Lisan al-Gaib, which meant the voice from the outer world, the one who would come from beyond the known places to give voice to all that the desert people held within their silent hearts. They spoke also of the Mahdi, the one who would lead them, the guide who would take them by the hand across the burning wastes of their present suffering and bring them at last into a future they could scarcely imagine. And though the two names were not always spoken as one, in the deep places of Fremen belief they had become woven together, so that the hope of a voice and the hope of a leader were one single and shining hope, held close and cherished through the driest and darkest of years. To understand how deeply this hope had rooted itself in the soul of a whole people, one had to look back many hundreds of years, to a time when the Bene Gesserit, the ancient sisterhood of subtle and far-seeing women, had sent their agents quietly among the scattered peoples of the many worlds. This work of theirs was called the Missionaria Protectiva, and its purpose was to plant, in the folklore and the sayings and the sacred stories of simple and isolated peoples, certain seeds of legend and prophecy that might one day serve to protect a member of the sisterhood who found herself alone and in danger among strangers. The seeds were words and images and expectations sown so gently and so long ago that the peoples who received them came in time to believe that these things had always been their own. Among the Fremen of Arrakis, these seeds had found soil more welcoming than any the sisterhood could have foreseen. For the desert itself was a teacher of patience and of longing, and a people who lived each day within a hair's breadth of death, guarding every drop of their body's water, learning to read the wind and the sand and the movements of the great worms, were a people already turned toward the promise of deliverance. What had been planted as a tool of protection had grown, over the slow turning of the centuries, into a faith that was wholly genuine, a belief so deep and so warm that no clever origin could have chilled it. The Fremen did not wait for a savior because a sisterhood had once whispered of one. They waited because their hearts, shaped by the sand and the stars, had come to know that waiting is the very shape of their lives. And so they watched. Through the long generations they watched for the signs that the old sayings had taught them to look for. They told one another, in the gentle voices of parents speaking to sleeping children, that the Mahdi would be aware of the truths that others could not see, that he would know the ways of the desert as though he had been born to them, and yet would come from beyond the desert, a stranger who was somehow also the most familiar of all. They said that a Bene Gesserit would recognize him, that his mother would be one of the sisterhood, and that through her the sacred words would be fulfilled. They said that he would lead them not only to freedom from their oppressors, but toward a greater and softer dream, the dream that lived at the very center of every Fremen heart, the dream of a green paradise upon Arrakis. That dream of green was the sweetest of all the things the Fremen carried in their long waiting, in the secret places of their sietches, guarded and tended with a devotion that never faltered. There lived among them a planetary ecologist's vision of what their world might one day become. They dreamed of open water lying beneath the open sky, of plants growing tall and unafraid, of a land where a person need not weigh every breath against the loss of moisture, where children might run across grass and know nothing of the stillsuit that had bound every generation before them. This was the paradise toward which the Promised One would lead them, and the longing for it made their waiting not bitter but tender, a waiting full of quiet hope rather than despair. Yet the years in which they waited were not gentle years, and this too shaped the readiness that grew among them. Upon Arrakis, the house of Harkonnen ruled with a heavy and pitiless hand, taking the spice from the sands and giving nothing back, hunting the Fremen when it suited them, and despising them always, treating the desert people as vermin rather than as the true children of the planet. The oppression pressed down upon the Fremen like the weight of the noonday sun, and beneath that weight the old hope did not wither, but instead grew stronger and more urgent, as a seed pressed deep into the earth reaches all the harder toward the light. Each cruelty of the Harkonnens, each stolen life, and each ruined sietch added to the great and gathering readiness of a people who felt, without quite being able to say it, that the time of the Promised One could not be far off. For there is a mood that comes over a people who have waited very long and suffered very much. A mood like the hush that falls upon the desert in the last moments before the dawn. When the darkness is deepest and yet every living thing seems already to lean toward the coming light. Such a mood had settled over the Fremen. In the words the elders spoke around the glow globes, in the songs the young sang low as they worked the moisture traps, in the dreams that visited the sleepers in the deep chambers of the rock, there ran a single quiet thread of expectation, a sense that the long night of their history was drawing at last toward its close. They did not know the day, and they did not know the hour, and they did not know the face of the one who would come. But they knew with the deep and wordless certainty of faith that he would come. And so the whole of that scattered and secret people, hidden in their sietches across the vast dry breadth of Arrakis, stood poised upon the edge of a great transformation, like a people gathered upon a shore in the darkness, listening for the sound of a returning tide. Every naib who counseled his sietch, every mother who taught her child the old sayings, every watermaster who guarded the precious stores, was in some quiet way a keeper of this one great hope, tending it as carefully as they tended their water and their worms and their lives. They were ready, more ready than they themselves fully knew, for the coming of the one who had been foretold across the long centuries of their waiting. Up next in Chapter 15, Paul Muad'Dib among the Fremen will follow the young stranger from beyond the desert as he takes his first steps into the hidden world of the sietch, and see how the ancient hope of a whole people began, ever so softly, to gather around him. Chapter 15. Paul Muad'Dib among the Fremen after the great house of Atreides had fallen in the night of treachery, and the fires had burned low over the ruined city of Arrakis. A young man and his mother walked out into the deep desert with nothing but the clothing on their bodies and the knowledge carried quietly in their minds. Paul Atreides was scarcely more than a boy in years, yet grief and danger had made him older than his years should have allowed, and beside him moved the Lady Jessica, his mother, trained in the old and secret ways of the sisterhood, watchful and gentle and afraid for them both. They had escaped the killing that had swallowed the Duke, and now the vast emptiness of the planet lay open before them, an ocean of sand under a sky of stars, so bright and so many that they seemed to pour their soft light down like a slow and silver rain. Into that silence came the people of the deep desert, the hidden folk whom the world called Fremen, moving across the dunes with a quietness that seemed almost a part of the wind. They came in the dark, wrapped in their still suits that preserved the water of their bodies, their eyes the deep and total blue of those who breathed the spice all the days of their lives. They found the mother and the son at the edge of the sand, and they weighed them with careful and ancient judgment. For the desert did not welcome the weak, and water was more precious to these people than any jewel or coin could ever be. Yet among them there were old stories, whispered from mother to child across the long generations, of a voice from the outer worlds who would come one day to lead them, and some among the Fremen looked upon the boy and wondered softly whether the old words were beginning to come true. In the days that followed, Paul walked among them and learned their ways with a patience that surprised even those who watched him most closely. He learned to move without rhythm across the open sand, for the great worms of the desert were drawn by any steady beat, and so he learned the broken and shuffling walk that carried a traveler safely over the dunes. He learned to read the colors of the horizon, to feel the coming of a storm before it rose, to gather the smallest drops of moisture, and to guard them as one guards a life. He learned the names the Fremen gave to the hours and the winds, and he learned the courtesy of the sietch, the deep caves where the tribes made their hidden homes, where water was kept in great sealed basins against the far, and dreamed of day when the desert itself might one day bloom. The Fremen were a proud people and a hard one, and they did not give their trust to any stranger for the mere asking of it. Paul earned his place among them slowly and truly, through the steadiness of his hands and the calm of his heart in moments of danger, and through a courage that never turned to cruelty. When the tribe took him fully into their number, they gave him the naming that belonged to those who were truly of the sietch, and he chose for his secret inner name the word usul, which meant the strength at the base of the pillar, the quiet and hidden thing upon which all else could safely rest. And when the manhood name was asked of him, the name that a Fremen carried openly before all the people, he took the name Muad'Dib, after the small desert mouse that lived where no other creature could live, the little one who was wise in the ways of the dry places and who taught the young how to survive. So he became Paul Muad'Dib, and the name moved among the sietches like a soft and spreading light. There was among the Fremen a young woman named Chani, a daughter of the desert, quick and fierce and gentle all at once, and between her and Paul there grew a bond that deepened with every passing season. She became his guide and his companion in the ways of her people, and in time she became the beloved of his heart, and their union bound him more closely still to the Fremen, for now he was not only a man who had learned their customs, but a man whose life was woven into the very fabric of their tribe. The old women of the sietch, keepers of memory and of the deep dreaming ways, watched the two of them together and felt that some great turning was drawing near, though they spoke of it only in low voices and only in the darkest hours of the night. Among all the things a Fremen youth must do to be counted a full rider of the desert, none was greater than the calling and the mounting of a sandworm, one of the immense and ancient makers of the deep sand, the vast creatures that the Fremen held in a reverence close to worship. When the day came for Paul to prove himself in this way, he went out upon the open dune with the tools of the maker riders in his hands, and he planted the summoner that beat its rhythm into the sand, and he waited with a calm that came from somewhere deep within him. The ground trembled, and out of the distance the great worm came rushing beneath the surface, and as it rose Paul set his hooks and climbed upon its towering back, and he rode it across the desert under the wide and burning sky. And the Fremen who watched him raised their voices in a soft and rolling joy. For a man who could ride the Maker was a man who belonged wholly to the sand, and the sight of him upon the great creature stirred in them the memory of the old promise once again. Now the Fremen had never been one people gathered under one hand. They lived scattered across the whole of the desert in their many hidden sietches, each tribe keeping to its own caves and its own water, meeting rarely and warily, bound together only by the shared hardness of their lives and by the old dreamed hope of a greener world. Yet as the name of Muad'Dib passed from sietch to sietch, and as the tales of his courage and his wisdom and his uncanny sight were told and told again around the quiet fires, something began to gather that had not gathered before. The scattered tribes began to look toward a single figure, and in that looking they began, slowly and gently, to become one. Paul did not force this unity upon them with fear, for he understood that a people driven only by fear would break in the end. Instead, he showed them a vision of what they might become, a picture of the desert itself made green with flowing water and living things, a dream so old and so deep that it lived already in every Fremen heart, waiting only for someone to speak it aloud. He gathered their strength and their skill and their fierce devotion, and he began to shape the scattered sietches into a single force, a people who were still hidden beneath the sand, but who were no longer weak or divided. The Fremen who had lived so long as forgotten wanderers of the waste began to feel, in the quiet of their caves, that they were becoming something new, a storm that had not yet broken, a power gathering slowly beneath the calm and starlit face of the desert night. And so the boy who had come out of the ruin of his house with nothing had become, among these fierce and gentle people, both a son of the sand and the bearer of their oldest hope, sleeping now in the deep sietch with the great desert breathing softly all around him. Up next in Chapter 16, the Fedaykin, the Death Commandos, will walk quietly among the fierce and devoted warriors who pledged their lives to Muad'Dib and learn softly how these gentle sleepers of the sietch became the sharpest edge of the coming storm. Chapter 16, the Fedaykin, the Death Commandos in the long quiet time that followed Paul's acceptance among the people of the deep desert, there arose around him a gathering of warriors unlike any the known universe had yet seen, and their story is a solemn one, gentle to tell in the soft hours of the night, when the world grows still and the sand of far Arrakis seems to whisper beneath the two moons. These were the Fedaykin, the chosen fighters, the ones who had already given their lives, and to understand them is to understand the strange and steady power that gathered around the young man the Fremen had come to name Muad'Dib. They were not many at first, only a slow and careful few, drawn to him one at a time by something they felt in his stillness, and yet in time they would become the sharpest edge of the whole rising storm. The name itself carried the weight of the thing, for in the old tongue of the Fremen, the word meant those who give their lives, the Death Commandos, and it was no idle title nor any boast made lightly around the sietch fires. To become one of the Fedaykin was to lay one's own life down before the cause as a stone is laid into the wall of a windtrap, quietly and without complaint, so that the water might be gathered for those who came after. A man or a woman who took up this pledge did so knowing that their days were already spent, already offered, and in that knowing there was not fear, but a great and settled calm. The calm of one who has passed beyond the small worries of the flesh and given themselves wholly to a purpose larger than any single life. They were drawn from among the desert people, who had been shaped across countless generations by the harshest world in all the Imperium, and every hardship of that world had gone into the making of them. From childhood, they had learned to walk the sand without rhythm, so that the great worms would not be drawn by their steps, and they had learned to breathe slowly inside the stillsuits that reclaimed the moisture of their own bodies, and they had learned patience beyond the patience of other peoples, the patience of those who measure water by the single drop and time by the slow turning of the seasons. All of this made them hard and quiet and enduring, and when such people took up the discipline of the Fedaykin, they became something the soft worlds of the Imperium could scarcely imagine. Their discipline was a thing of deep and quiet beauty, for it did not shout nor make display of itself. A Fedaykin moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long training and longer self-mastery, wasting nothing, neither breath, nor gesture, nor moisture, nor thought. In the practice yards of the hidden sietches they honed their skill with the krisk knife, the sacred blade ground from the tooth of the Great Maker, and with the many other weapons the desert had taught them to wield. And they trained also in the strange fighting arts that Paul's own mother, the Lady of the Bene Gesserit, had carried into the desert and shared with the people who sheltered her son. Slow and gentle was their breathing even in the fiercest of these exercises, for they had learned that the calm mind strikes truest, and that the warrior who is at peace within himself is the warrior hardest to defeat. And their ferocity, when it was called upon, was a wonder and a terror, all the more so because it lived within such quietness. They did not rage nor lose themselves in the heat of battle, for they had already given their lives and had nothing left to protect and nothing left to fear. This is the great secret of the Fedaykin, and it is worth resting upon gently in the hush of the night, that a person who has truly set aside all fear of death becomes something almost beyond the reach of ordinary force. Where other soldiers held back a small hidden part of themselves, some last corner of caution that whispered of survival, the Fedaykin held back nothing at all, and so they poured themselves entirely into whatever the moment required, and few could stand against such wholehearted purpose. In the wider Imperium there were soldiers spoken of with dread across 1,000 worlds, and these were the Sardaukar, the terrible troops of the Padishah Emperor himself, trained upon the prison planet of Seleucia Secundus, a world so cruel that merely to survive its childhood was to be forged into a killer of fearsome skill. For long ages the Sardaukar had been thought unbeatable, the iron foundation upon which the emperor's whole rule was raised, and their name alone had been enough to still rebellion in its cradle. Yet the desert of Arrakis was crueler still than Seleucia Secundus, and the people it had shaped were harder yet, and when the Fedaykin at last met the Sardaukar in the open, it was found that the death commandos of Muad'Dib were more than a match for the finest soldiers the emperor could send. This was a thing that shook the foundations of the whole known universe, quietly at first, like the first faint trembling of sand before the worm rises, and then with a force that no throne could long withstand. Around Paul himself the Fedaykin took their place as his honor guard, the ring of devotion that stood always near him, and there was a tenderness in this that softened all their hardness. They watched over him not out of any command laid upon them, but out of a love that had grown from what they saw in him, the way he had taken up their customs and honored their dead and wept the ritual water and become, slowly and truly, one of their own. To guard the life of Muad'Dib was for them the highest of all offerings, and they gave it gladly, standing their long watches through the desert nights with the patience of stone, asking nothing in return but the honor of the task itself. They were also the spearhead of his rising power, the first and sharpest thrust of the great movement that was gathering across Arrakis. And wherever the need was greatest, and the danger most severe, there the Fedaykin were sent, and there they gave whatever was asked. Yet even in this, even as their fame spread and their deeds multiplied, they kept the quiet solemnity that had marked them from the first, for they never forgot that they were the ones who had already died. There is a particular gentleness in the company of such people, a peace that settles over all who stand among them, because they carry no hunger for glory and no fear of loss, only a steady and unshakable devotion that asks for nothing and endures all things. And so, as the night deepens and the desert grows cool beneath its moons, it is a kindly thing to hold in mind the image of these quiet warriors at their rest, the death commandos of Muad'Dib, sitting in the soft dark of the sietch, with their weapons laid aside, breathing slowly, their fierce hearts at peace, having given their lives already, and finding in that gift a calm deeper than any that untroubled ease could bring. They were the finest soldiers the known universe had yet produced, and yet in the still hours they were only men and women resting near the one they had chosen to follow, keeping their gentle watch while the sands turned slowly beneath the stars. Up next in Chapter 17, the Fremen Jihad Across the Stars, we'll drift softly outward from the quiet sietches of Arrakis to follow the great and terrible tide that would carry the green banner of Muad'Dib far beyond the desert world, spreading across the vast dark reaches of the known universe like water sinking gently into thirsting sand. Chapter 17. The Fremen Jihad Across the Stars. There was a time, and it was not so very long ago in the memory of the old ones, when the Fremen were nothing more than a rumor whispered along the edges of the desert. A people so hidden that the great houses of the Imperium believed the deep sands of Arrakis to be empty of any life worth counting. They lived beneath the dunes in their sietch communities, sealed away from the burning day, keeping their water and their names and their long, slow dream of a green world buried close against their hearts. And the wider galaxy passed over them as a sleeper passes over a single grain of sand without ever knowing it is there. In those years, the Fremen asked for nothing from the stars. They asked only to be left alone, to walk their windswept country in the cool of the night, and to carry their dead gently down into the ground so that the water of the body might be given back to the tribe. Yet the same desert that had hidden them for 1,000 generations had also been shaping them, slowly and without hurry, into something the universe had never before seen. The pitiless heat and the endless thirst and the ceaseless nearness of the great sandworms had made of them a people patient beyond the patience of ordinary men, fierce in the defense of one another, and utterly unafraid of death. For death upon Arrakis was only the returning of a person's water to those who remained. And into this hardened and waiting people there came at last a young man from the far reaches of the empire, a boy raised in the halls of a fallen house, who took the desert name of Muad'Dib, and who saw, with eyes that could look along the branching pathways of what was yet to come, that these hidden tribes were the sharpest and most terrible weapon that had ever lain unclaimed beneath a sun. When the battles upon Arrakis were finished, and the old emperor had been unseated, and Paul Muad'Dib had taken for himself the golden throne of the known worlds, the Fremen did not lay down their crysknives and return quietly to their caverns, as some among them had once imagined they might. Instead, the fire that had been kindled in the sietches spilled outward past the sky, and the simple desert people found themselves lifted, all at once, from the margins of the galaxy to its very center, no longer a rumor, but a wind that would soon touch every inhabited world beneath the scattered stars. For the faith that had grown up around the name of Muad'Dib was not a gentle and quiet faith. It was a burning thing, a certainty so complete that it left no room within the heart for doubt, and it swept the Fremen up as a great storm sweeps up the loose sand of the open bled and carries it across the whole face of the planet. They believed, with the whole of their fierce and singing souls, that their beloved leader was the one who had been promised to them across the long centuries, and that to carry his name to the farthest corners of the universe was the highest and holiest labor that any man or woman could take up. And so they went out from Arrakis in their thousands, and then in their tens of thousands, packed into the bellies of the great transports, singing the songs of the deep desert as their ships climbed away from the only home that any of them had ever known. The jihad that followed was a thing so vast that no single mind could hold the whole of it. World after world felt the coming of the Fremen legions, and the banners of Muad'Dib were raised above cities that had never so much as heard the name of Arrakis before that hour. Kingdoms that had stood in comfortable pride for age upon age found their ancient certainties swept away in the space of a single season, and the men and women of 100 settled planets learned to speak. In awe and in trembling, the desert name of a boy who had grown up among the dunes. The scale of it was almost past the reckoning of ordinary thought, for the crusade did not touch a dozen worlds, nor 100, but reached out at last across the whole breadth of the settled galaxy, until the followers of Muad'Dib walked as conquerors upon 1,000,000 worlds beneath 1,000,000 suns. And the cost of that vast conquest was a heavy one, heavier by far than the young emperor had ever wished to carry. For a holy war, once it has been set loose among the stars, is not a thing that any single hand can gather back, and the storm that Paul had seen coming in his visions rolled onward across the years and swallowed up a great multitude of lives, both of those who marched beneath his banner and of those who stood before it. The chronicles that were kept in later ages spoke of numbers so great that the mind grows quiet and still before them, of worlds made silent, and of peoples scattered like seed upon the wind. And though the tellers of this gentle tale need not linger upon the sorrow of it, the sorrow was real, and it lay always at the very bottom of the triumph, like water lying dark and cold beneath the warm surface of the sand. There was in it, too, a strange and tender mixture of pride and of tragedy that has few equals in all the long histories of the human family. For here was a people who had been the most hidden and the most humble of all the peoples of the empire, a nation of water-gatherers and worm-riders who had asked only to be forgotten, and now that same people sat in the high seats of 1,000 worlds and gave the law to lords whose ancestors would never once have deigned to look upon a Fremen face. The children of the deep desert became rulers and governors and captains of great fleets, and they carried with them into palaces of marble and gardens heavy with green the memory of the dry wind and the taste of the recycled water and the slow bright wheeling of the desert stars. It was a rising up so complete and so sudden that it must be counted among the great wonders of the age, and yet it was a rising that carried a shadow within it, for in leaving their desert the Fremen had begun, in some quiet and unspoken way, to leave behind the very thing that had made them what they were. And in the midst of all this vast and thundering triumph there sat the young emperor himself, Paul Muad'Dib, upon his golden throne at the center of the storm, and his heart was heavy with a grief that few around him could understand, for he had seen, before ever the first ship rose from Arrakis, all the terrible branching of the days that were to come, and he had known that the jihad would spill out across the stars whether he willed it or not, and that even his own hand, strong as it was, could not close the door upon the tempest once the door had swung open. He grieved for the countless lives that were carried away upon the flood, and he grieved for his beloved Fremen, who were being changed by their own victory into something other than the pure and simple desert people he had first come to love. And he carried that sorrow quietly, deep beneath the calm and the majesty of his rule, as a man carries an old wound that never fully closes. So the desert people passed out of their long hiddenness and into the bright and terrible light of empire, and the whole galaxy was remade in the space of a single lifetime by the fervor of the tribes of Arrakis, and the name of Muad'Dib went out to the very edges of the known worlds. And though the story of that great crusade is a grave one, and holds within it both the glory of a humble people lifted high and the deep quiet sadness of a storm that could not be stilled, it is also, in its way, one of the most extraordinary tales that the long night has ever gathered up and kept. Up next in Chapter 18, Chani, Daughter of the Desert, we'll turn away from the thunder of the stars and back to the quiet dunes of Arrakis, to walk beside the young desert woman who loved Paul Muad'Dib, and to rest a while in the gentle story of her life among the tribes and the tender bond that steadied him through all the long years of empire. Chapter 18, Chani, Daughter of the Desert. In the long shadow that the jihad cast across the stars, in that time when the green banner of Muad'Dib was carried into 10,000 worlds by legions who had learned their courage in the burning silences of Arrakis, there was one who stood always at the center of the storm, and yet belonged, in her deepest heart, not to the empire, but to the sand. Her name was Chani, and she was a daughter of the desert, born of its harshness and its beauty, shaped by its long patience, and she moved through the great events of that age with the quiet certainty of one who had never forgotten where she came from. While the world beyond Arrakis learned to speak of Paul Atreides as a god and an emperor and a force that bent history itself, Chani knew him as something simpler and truer, and it was this simplicity, this steady and unbowed love, that made her the most precious thing in all his vast dominion. She was the daughter of Liet Kynes, the planetologist whom the Fremen had loved and followed as few men in their long history had ever been loved, the imperial ecologist who had given his life and his dream to the Sand People and taught them to believe that Arrakis might one day bloom. From her father, Chani inherited a mind that looked upon the desert not only with reverence, but with understanding, a way of seeing the dunes and the deep places and the great slow breathing of the planet as parts of a single living pattern. And from her mother, a woman of the Fremen born into the sietch and raised in the old disciplines, Chani inherited the harder gifts of the desert, the endurance and the wariness and the fierce self-command that allowed a body to live and thrive where the sun was an enemy and every drop of water was counted and treasured beyond gold. In her, these two inheritances met and became one, the dreamer and the survivor woven together, so that she carried within her both the vision of what Arrakis might become and the strength that the present Arrakis demanded of all who would call it home. She grew up in the sietches, those hidden communities carved into the rock beneath the open sky, where the Fremen lived their careful and communal life far from the eyes of the great houses who imagined the deep desert to be empty. There she learned the 1,000 small skills upon which survival depended, the reading of the wind and the weather, the sealing of a stillsuit so that no precious moisture was lost, the silent walking across the sand in the broken rhythm that would not summon the great worms from their slumber. She learned to fight, as all Fremen learned to fight, and she became skilled with the crysknife, that pale curved blade shaped from the tooth of a slain worm, a weapon sacred and personal to each who bore one. In her hands, the crysknife was not merely an instrument of defense, but an extension of her spirit, quick and sure and unafraid, and those who watched her move in the training grounds of the sietch saw at once that here was no soft child, but a true daughter of a warrior people, proud and capable and entirely herself. It was in the deep desert, in the days after Paul and his mother Jessica had fled into the sand from the ruin of their house, that Chani first came to stand beside the young man who would remake the world. She had seen him in the visions that troubled his prescient sleep long before she met him in waking life. A face out of the future that came to him again and again, and when at last they met among the Fremen of the sietch, it was as though two halves of a foretold thing had been quietly joined. She became his teacher in the ways of the desert and his guide through the harsh customs of her people, and slowly, in the manner of the Fremen who wasted no words and made no idle promises, she became his companion and his beloved. Their love was not a thing of ceremony or of politics, but a bond forged in shared hardship and shared purpose, tested against the sand and the enemy and the long, uncertain nights, and it held between them a warmth that neither the passing years nor the immense burdens of empire would ever wholly cool. She bore him a child in those early years, a small son born in the sietch, and though sorrow would come to that first child in the violence of the times, the love between Chani and Paul deepened through all that they endured together. She stood beside him when he drank the sacred water and passed through the ordeal that carried him into the deepest reaches of his gift, and she watched over his still body through the long unconsciousness, refusing to surrender hope, and it was her presence, her patient and unwavering presence, that helped call him back from the far country of his visions. Again and again through his rise she was there, not as a follower who trailed behind a great man, but as a partner who walked at his side as an equal in spirit, sharing the counsels of war and the counsels of the heart, offering him the plain truth of the desert when all the world around him had begun to offer only worship. When at last the green banner was raised in triumph and Paul Muad'Dib ascended to the imperial throne, when the whole galaxy bowed to the boy she had first known as a stranger in the sand, Chani remained beside him, and yet her place was not the place her heart might have wished. For the intricacies of power required that Paul take the daughter of the fallen emperor as his wife in name, a marriage of policy that bound the great houses to his rule and secured the peace he had bought at so terrible a price. And so Chani, who was his true beloved and the mother of his children, became by the cold arithmetic of statecraft his concubine rather than his empress, honored above all others in his heart, yet denied the title that lesser and colder hands would hold. This was a sorrow she bore with the quiet dignity that was hers by nature and by upbringing, understanding the necessity even as she felt its weight, carrying the ache of it as the Fremen carried all their private griefs, deep within and unspoken. Yet through all the grandeur and all the sorrow of those years at the summit of the world, Chani never became a creature of the palace. She remained what she had always been, a woman of the sand, proud and loyal and unbowed, keeping within her the desert's clean simplicity in the midst of the empire's endless intrigue. The perfumes and the ceremonies and the vast machinery of imperial life could not touch the thing at her core, and Paul, who was surrounded on every side by those who wanted something from him, found in her the one true rest that his troubled and far-seeing soul could know. She was his desert spring, the still water in the hidden place, the one who loved the man beneath the myth and asked of him nothing that he could not freely give. In her he saw not the emperor and not the Messiah, but simply himself. And in that seeing there was a mercy that all his power could never have purchased. And so she remained, through triumph and through grief, through the burdens of a love bound up with the fate of worlds, always and unchangeably a daughter of the desert, faithful to her people and to her heart and to the harsh beloved planet that had made her. Her strength was the strength of the dunes that endure the sun. Her love the deep and hidden water that no drought could exhaust, and her spirit, the proud free spirit of the Fremen, who bowed to no one and belonged to no one but themselves. Up next in Chapter 19, The Greening of Arrakis and Its Cost, we'll drift gently out across the changing dunes to witness the great dream of Liet Kynes slowly coming true. The slow blooming of a desert world, and the quiet and unexpected price that such a transformation would ask of the sand and its people. Chapter 19. The Greening of Arrakis and Its Cost. In the long, quiet drift of years that followed the days of Chani upon the open sand, the world of Arrakis began to change in ways so slow and so patient that no single pair of eyes could hold the whole of it in one lifetime. And so it is that we tell of it gently now. The way one tells of a season turning, while the little ones grow warm and heavy with sleep. For there had always been a dream folded deep inside the hearts of the Fremen, a dream that had been carried from generation to generation like a smooth stone worn kind by many hands, and that dream was of water, of a green and living world where their children might walk beneath open skies and never again count each single drop of moisture as though it were the whole of their fortune. It was a soft and beautiful dream, and it had been given shape and direction long before by a planetologist named Liet Kynes, and by his father before him, men who had walked the deep desert and had taught the Fremen to believe that the sand itself could one day be persuaded to bloom. Kynes had shown them how to plant grasses that would hold the dunes in place, and how to sink wind traps that gathered the faint moisture from the night air, and how to gather that water away in hidden basins beneath the rock, saving it patiently across the centuries until at last there would be enough to change the very face of the planet. The Fremen had labored at this dream in secret for a very long time, digging their catch basins and tending their small hidden plantings in the sheltered places, believing with a faith as steady as the turning of the twin moons that one distant day the desert would soften, and the rains would come, and the poisoned dryness that had shaped every hour of their lives would loosen its grip forever. And in the reign of Paul, and in the long years that unfolded after him, that ancient dream at last began to come true, and this is the gentle and sorrowful heart of our story tonight. For the water that the Fremen had saved so carefully was released into the work of terraforming, and the planet, so long a place of endless golden sand, began by slow degrees to grow green, where there had been only dune upon dune stretching away to the shimmer of the horizon. There came now stands of grass, and then low shrubs, and then trees that had never before found root in that thirsty ground. The catch basins filled and overflowed, and open water gathered in the low places, still and shining beneath the stars, a thing so strange to Fremen eyes that the oldest among them could scarcely believe what they were seeing. Rain, which their grandparents had known only as a word in the old stories, began to fall upon the northern lands, soft and cool and unhurried, soaking into soil that drank it gladly. Flowers opened where there had been only the track of the sandworm, and birds came, and the air itself grew heavy and sweet with moisture, and the great dream of Liet Kynes stood at last upon the threshold of its fulfillment. Yet nestled within that gladness there lay a cost so deep and so quiet that at first almost no one wished to speak of it. And it is a cost that we must tell of softly. For it is the kind of truth that turns a happy ending slowly into something tender and grieving. The great sandworms of Arrakis, the Makers, the enormous and ancient creatures who moved beneath the dunes like slow leviathans, and who had shaped the whole living faith of the Fremen, could not endure the water. For the worms, water was a poison, a thing that unmade them from within, and the open pools, and the falling rain, and the damp and greening soil that the Fremen had longed for across all their generations, were, to the Makers, a slow and gathering death. As the world grew green, the worms grew fewer. Where once the deep desert had trembled with their passing, there came now a stillness, and the sign of the Maker grew rare upon the softened land, and the little sand trout and the small beginnings that had once become the mighty worms could no longer complete their ancient turning in a world grown wet. And here lay the deepest sorrow of all, wound tightly around the sorrow of the worms themselves. For it was the sandworms alone who made the spice. The melange that had drawn the whole of the known worlds to Arrakis. The spice that lengthened life and opened the inner eye and bound the great powers of the universe to this single desert planet, came only from the deep work of the Makers within the sand. As the worms faded, so too did the flow of the spice begin to fail, growing thinner and more precious, and more difficult to gather with each passing year. The very treasure that had made Arrakis the most sought and the most guarded world beneath the stars was drying away like a spring in high summer, and the green paradise that rose in its place could offer no melange in exchange, for the water that gave life to the grass took life from the worm, and the two could not share the same world. So it was that the Fremen came slowly to understand the shape of what they had done, and it settled upon them the way dusk settles upon a valley, without a sound. In winning their dream, they had begun to lose the thing that had made them who they were. The desert had been harsh, and it had been cruel, and it had asked of them a discipline and a courage almost beyond telling. But it had also given them their strength, their deep water discipline, their fierce and quiet unity, their reverence for the Maker who was to them nearly a god. All of these things had been carved from the dry and burning stone of their world. And now, as the water came and the green spread and the sand grew soft with life, the sharp, hard edges of the old Fremen began to blur and to gentle and to fade. Their children, growing up amid grass and open pools, would never know the deep desert as their grandparents had known it, would never ride the great worm across the trackless dunes, would never feel in their bones the terrible and holy austerity that had shaped a people out of thirst. There is a particular ache in a dream that comes true, and in the coming unmakes the very ground it grew from, and this was the ache that lay upon the greening of Arrakis. The Fremen had asked for water, and water was given, and the water was both the answer to their longing and the ending of their world. All at once, gently and without malice, the way the tide comes in over a castle built of sand. They had loved the desert even as they had struggled against it, and now, in softening it, they were saying a long and unspoken farewell to the makers, to the spice, to the fierce clean emptiness of the dunes, and in the end to a great part of themselves. It was a beautiful thing that was happening to their world, and it was a mournful thing, and both of these were true together, folded into one another like the light and the shadow of a single slow evening. And so the greening spread across Arrakis, patient and lovely and terrible, and the worms grew still, and the spice grew thin, and the old ways began to loosen their long hold upon the hearts of a changing people, all of it unfolding as softly as a breath let out at the end of a very long day. Up next in Chapter 20, The Fading of the Old Fremen Ways, we'll drift gently into the quiet story of how a proud desert people, given at last their green and watered world, slowly let go of the harsh and holy customs that had once made them what they were, and what tender remnants of the old desert faith lingered on in the hearts of those who still remembered the sand. Chapter 20. The fading of the old Fremen ways, and so the dream that had been carried in the hearts of the Fremen for 100 generations, came at last to pass. And the deep sand of Arrakis, which the offworlders had called dune, softened and darkened, and began to hold the memory of water within itself. The planting that had begun in the shadow of the great southern latitudes spread slowly outward across the whole face of the world, patient as the turning of the seasons. And the wind that had once carried only dust now carried the scent of green growing things, and the poignant thing, the thing that no one had truly foreseen in all the long dreaming of it, was that the winning of the dream became also, in the fullness of time, the ending of the people who had dreamed it. For the Fremen had been shaped by the desert as a blade is shaped by the hammer and the fire, and every hardness in them, every discipline, and every silent grace had been given to them by the thirst of the land and the nearness of death. Their care for water had been a religion and a science both, and the smallest drop of it had been counted and honored and returned to the tribe when a life was spent. Their stillsuits had held their bodies close against the dryness, reclaiming even the breath of their lungs and the moisture of their skin, so that a man walking out into the deep desert carried his own small world of water about him, and knew to the very heartbeat how long that world would last. And now, gently, that necessity was passing away. The canals filled and the qanats ran, and the catch basins that the Fremen had cut into the rock across 10,000 nights of labor brimmed over with rain that fell now from clouds that had never before gathered in the skies of Arrakis. Palms rose where the sietch children had once learned to walk without leaving a track. Grass came, and then flowers, and then the small, soft creatures that follow after grass and flowers. And the water that had been dearer than blood became at last so plentiful that a child might waste it and think nothing of the wasting. And in the wide loosening of that plenty, without anyone choosing it, and without anyone able to prevent it, the old discipline began quietly to dissolve. The great sandworms, the makers, Shai-Hulud himself, the vast slow lords of the deep sand who had ruled the dryness since before the coming of men, could not endure the water that the greening brought. For water was poison to them, and death to the sand trout that were their beginning. And as the moisture crept into the deep places, the worms withdrew into the last shrinking reaches of the true desert, and there, one by one across the long years, they died. With them died the wild abundance of the spice, for the spice had been born of their long cycle in the sand. And with the passing of the worms there, passed also the thing that had made Arrakis the single most desired world in all the empire. And the Fremen, who had ridden the makers and worshipped them, and named their god after them, watched the last of the great ones sink beneath the sand, and felt in that watching a grief that had no words, for they were losing at once their god and their enemy, and the mirror in which they had known themselves. The generations turned. The children of the sietches grew up in towns where the air was moist, and the fountains played, and they wore soft garments, and drank freely, and slept without the low continual awareness of thirst that had been their grandparents' constant companion. They kept the old words, and they kept the old rites, the water ceremonies and the funeral gatherings, and the long-chanted names of the ancestors, but they kept them now, as one keeps a beautiful thing behind glass, a ceremony emptied of the desperate need that had once given it meaning. They danced the Kreiskneif dances, but their blades had never been quenched in the killing of a foe, and few among them could have said with certainty why the dance turned as it turned. They spoke of the deep desert with reverence, but many of them had never crossed it, and some had never so much as seen the open sand beyond the green terraces of their comfortable cities. These were the ones whom later ages would call the museum Fremen, the keepers of a heritage they no longer lived. And there was no cruelty in the name, only sorrow, for they were gentle folk, and they meant no dishonor to their fathers. They performed the old ways faithfully, with love even. But the ways had become a performance, a memory acted out, a song whose melody was remembered though its urgent reason had been forgotten. The fierceness that had once made a single sietch a match for the legions of the empire had softened into courtesy, and the silence that had once been the discipline of survival had become merely a manner, a graceful habit worn lightly over lives that no longer required it. And in that long, slow fading there came, in a later age, a ruler who understood what was being lost and grieved for it more deeply than any. The god Emperor Leto II, who had taken into himself the sand trout and become across the centuries something no longer wholly a man, and who reigned across the empire for 3,500 years. He it was who preserved upon the greened world a single remnant of the true desert, a last reserve of dry sand kept apart from the water, the Sarir, and there he sheltered a remnant of the old worms and a remnant of the old ways, guarding them as one guards the last coal of a fire against the coming of the dawn. He gathered a people to keep the desert ways alive, and he made of himself the living memory of everything the Fremen had been, so that even as the wider world forgot, one small dry corner of it remembered, and one great and patient being held the memory in trust across the long turning of the years. Yet even Leto II, who could see far along the paths of what was to come, knew that no remnant can hold forever against the tide of time, and that the true Fremen, the free people of the deep sand, the riders of the makers, the folk who had counted their wealth in water and their honor in silence, had already passed into the country of memory from which no people returns. What he preserved was a keeping and a remembrance, precious beyond price. But it was not the living thing itself, for the living thing had belonged to the dryness, and the dryness was very nearly gone. And this is the gentle and the necessary truth toward which the whole long story bends, that the Fremen won everything they had ever asked for, and in the winning were transformed beyond recognition, and there is no bitterness that need be felt in this, for it is the way of all dreams that are truly fulfilled. They had wanted a green world, and they made a green world, and the green world had no more need of the hard and thirsty people who had made it. They faded not in defeat, but in the fullness of their victory, dissolving softly into the comfort they themselves had dreamed and the memory of who they had been, fierce and free and faithful and unbroken, remained upon the world like the scent of spice that lingers in a room long after the spice itself is gone. Let them rest, then, the old Fremen, in the deep quiet of what they were. Let the sand be still, and the worms sleep in whatever dark remains to them, and the cool green water lie untroubled beneath the 2 moons of Arrakis. Their long thirst is ended, and their long labor is done, and the dream they carried through the burning centuries has come home at last to the place of its rest. There is a dignity that no fading can diminish, the dignity of a people who kept faith with themselves across the hardest of all worlds, and that dignity abides now in the great calm of things completed, gentle and enduring and wholly at peace, as all things come at the end into peace, and into rest, and into the long soft silence after the story is told. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we learned who the Fremen were, the Zensuni wanderers and their long migration to Arrakis, and the hard and hidden life they built in the deep desert. We walked through the sietches and their society, the water discipline and the tribe's precious hoard, the stillsuits and the great sandworms they learned to ride. We heard their quiet religion and the seeds the sisterhood had sown among them. We followed Liet Kynes and his dream of a green Arrakis, Stilgar and the Nabes, the coming of the Mahdi, and the rise of the Fedaykin who carried Paul Muad'Dib to power. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each name and each grain of sand drift gently away from you, down through still dark water, until only calm remains. You are safe. You are warm. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If these long, slow stories help you sleep, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming.